she was an outcast among her own. He is the formidable alpha to whom fate has bound her life. Olive, a wolf without a wolf, is forced to fight for a place in a world that has rejected her. Enemies surround her, and even those who should be allies turn against her. Can she prove to everyone that her strength lies not in transformation, but in her unbroken spirit? Find out in this story of survival, love, and the fight for a place under the moon. What's the matter, little Ollie? Can't shift. I brought my arms up in front of my face in an attempt to block the next blow that I was certain would be coming my way. Instead of hitting me square in the face, Tiffany, my arch nemesis and greatest foe, went for my stomach, successfully knocking the air out of me and forcing me to hunch over. This was my normal. If I didn't get a good ass kicking, I would be worried something was wrong, in all honesty. It was one of the many perks I got as the only werewolf in my pack who wasn't actually able to shift into a wolf. That and the endless teasing. Not only could I not shift into a wolf, but no matter how hard I trained, I still could never come close to being as strong as everyone else. Even at my best, I was there mediocre. It was frustrating to say the least. Poor Olive, Daddy's not here to protect you anymore. Tiffany circled around me like I was her next meal. I knew she was just being cruel and using my father's disappearance as a way to get under my skin. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. A sly smirk crossed her features. She knew she had hit the right nerve when I suddenly lunged towards her in an attempt to tackle her to the ground. Unsuccessfully, might I add. She gracefully stepped aside and I landed hard on my shoulder on the other side of Tiffany and her cronies straight into an icy puddle of thawing snow. She hovered over me and was about to finish off today's torment session when she was distracted by a loud screeching over the school's intercom system. The high-pitched sound sent me, and just about every student in view cringing and covering their ears. The noise was quickly followed by the sound of fumbling over the microphone, and then suddenly, blasting forth were the opening chords to AC/DC's Highway to Hell. I slowly dropped my hands from my ears, and with a furrowed brow, I pushed myself onto my elbows out of the freezing puddle. Something this bizarre and just plain stupid had to be the end of the year senior prank. Just as quickly as the song appeared, it was replaced by another screeching sound, and this time, there were angry voices that followed. "You idiot, this is not what he asked for. It adds a dangerous element to it all. You know, it'll scare the brats and make this all the more legendary when there was the sharp, unmistakable sound of a gunshot ringing out over the intercom system, and then one of the voices went silent. Someone cleared their voice and took control of the mic once more. Greetings, young members of the Grace Pack. It is my greatest pleasure to inform you that your pack is currently under siege. There was a collective gasp between Tiffany and her little minions and just about every student on the campus. Everyone frantically began turning their heads, searching for any sign of the aforementioned siege that surely was raging just beyond the school walls. I took this opportunity to scramble fully off the ground and make a hasty retreat away from them. In our pack, the school was located on the hill away from the central town where everyone lived. We were so far isolated that there was no way we could have heard any alarm or sign of a battle. We have every possible exit closed off, so if we could just skip over the frantic escape attempts, it would make our job so much easier. You will be collected and inspected to see if you are fit to be a part of our pack. If you resist, or you don't pass our inspection." He trailed off sadistically, leaving the entire school hanging on his every word. Well, let's just say you really don't want to fail or cause any trouble. Almost immediately after his ominous warning clicked off of the intercom, foreign wolves and men suddenly burst out from the central building and invaded the yard. It was chaos. Some students ignored the man on the microphone's warning, shifting and foolishly attempted to go after the far more experienced warrior wolves, while others were simply running terrified and vainly searching for an escape. In just a matter of seconds, my final day of senior year was transformed a horror movie of screaming and crying everywhere I looked. I stood in shock, paralyzed to my spot, unable to force myself to react or do anything but stare at the hellish scene that was unfolding before my eyes. A few students who had mustered up the courage to try and fight were no match for the much larger and experienced wolves. They were now lying on the floor, silent and unmoving. Others were simply being snatched up and dragged inside of the auditorium, building no shifting or blood spilt. These were wolves from some foreign, sick and twisted pack, taking pleasure in mowing down innocent high schoolers an unfair battle. It was only when a rough hand was clamped onto my shoulder that I was torn from my own head and forced to step back into reality. I jumped at the touch and immediately tore around to identify who was grabbing me. The man was significantly older and had a crazy look in his eye. That's right, just one. The other one was missing, but I'm assuming if it were there, it would be an equally crazy and terrifying. Despite the size of the man and my lack of strength, wolf, dignity, have I mentioned lack of wolf? I twisted under his grasp and quickly brought my fist up into his jaw. I could do this. I could totally survive this. I just had to remember my training, but holy SHT, why was his jaw so hard? As I spared a glance to look down at my hand, the man, completely unaffected by my attack, simply grabbed me by the back of my neck. The brute lifted me off of the ground and held me at his eye level. He squinted at me. His gaze was cold and uncomfortable as he took me in. After a few moments of holding my struggling figure effortlessly off the ground, he grunted once in satisfaction, just as he brought his other fist up and sent it crashing into my head, rendering me unconscious. Oh, okay. I swear this isn't going to be boring. This lil prologue just had to be written and out of the way before the good shit. Can happen 3. This is my first time writing on here in ages, but I was inspired, so hopefully this works out and hopefully people dig it as much as I do. Roman 20Q when I finally came to. A hand immediately gripped my hair harshly and jerked my head up, forcing me to take in the scene before me and recall what had taken place. It hadn't been some sick nightmare. It was all really happening right before my eyes. The invaders were using the auditorium's stage to parade students up one by one, no doubt for the inspection they'd mentioned. I felt sick. Just then, the man who knotted his hand in my hair yanked me up to my feet and shoved me towards the line of my peers. "Move, little pup." He growled into my ear. His words made me want to disappear and get as far away from him and his sour breath as possible. My eyes were wide as I watched the testing process take place. They stood in a semicircle and brought us onto the center of the stage, where they then forced us to shift. Just my luck. There was a man with a clipboard who was taking detailed notes. It was after the shift when the clipboard man either sent them outside or had them brought backstage. By the time he dragged me to the line, there were no longer any others in front of me. With a final shove, he sent me into the stairs. Like literally into the stairs. There was hooting and hollering as I slowly picked myself up to climb the remaining stairs and walk onto the stage. This was it. I was going to die in my high school's auditorium in front of everyone. I couldn't shift. Not once in my entire life had I ever even felt my wolf before. I would fail the test because I couldn't do the one thing they asked, and then they would kill me because who wants to deal with a deadbeat werewolf who can't even shift? The man with the clipboard stood on the side of the raucous group of wolves. He had dark blonde hair that fell dirty on his face. I could see a vertical scar that rested across his eye as he looked me over quickly. Name. My heart was pounding, and with their hearing, I'm sure they had no trouble picking up the thundering in my chest. My mind was racing, and my body annoyingly began shaking. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Name, age. This time when I tried to speak, a voice came out. I just wasn't sure that it was mine. Olive Ludovic, 18. The girl who responded was much more confident, almost fearless, the exact opposite to how I felt in reality. I watched him scribble my information down before giving a pointed look towards the wolf closest to him. The man I immediately recognized as the one who originally knocked me out, the eyeless wonder. I instinctively took a half step backwards and away from him, immediately hoping both he and the crowd didn't notice my small display of fear. But because I am me, and because life loves to SHT on me, my moments had not gone unnoticed as I wished. Shift. This time it wasn't the clipboard man or the eyeless dude, it was a collective whisper from the group. Different voices from the circle all began to chant and call for me to shift. I stood there before them. I closed my eyes, suddenly becoming religious and praying to anything to bring me my wolf in that moment. Please, please, please. Nothing. When I opened them, I was face to face with Eyeless, and he immediately shoved me backwards. If you're not going to shift on your own, we'll just have get it out of you. One way or another, we'll get the information we need. Pretty girl. I fell back onto my ass, my hair obstructing my vision temporarily as I scrambled back onto my feet. When I pushed my hair away from my eyes, I noticed that eyeless was gone. That was until I heard growling coming right behind me. With a single large hand wrapped around my bruised and battered arm, Mateo hauled my struggling form off of the stage and through the closest exit. Once we were out of the view of prying eyes, he immediately shoved me up against the nearest gum-covered wall right next to a dumpster. I will never belong to you. I will never be your mate, and I will never forgive you for what you've done here. I spat out furiously upon impact with the aforementioned gross-ass wall. I made sure to get my point across before he could say anything. Mateo's eyes were quickly shifting darker the more and more I continued to speak, and I swear I could see a fang popping out. Besides the fact that I could never be his mate, considering I was yet to make contact with my wolf. I suppose arguing over it all was null because I could never reciprocate the bond, but I was just that repulsed with the idea. I had to start SHT. Mateo's hand suddenly slammed into the wall directly beside my head, tiny pieces of brick and possibly gum crumbling and falling onto my shoulder. I am the most powerful alpha on this side of the hemisphere, maybe even the world someday. We'll have to see. But you, on the other hand, you are the exact opposite of what I'm destined to be with. You think that I want this, that I want you as a mate? You are weak, you clearly lack intelligence, you are stupidly loud. You don't come from a formidable pack, and I could keep going. I mean, look at yourself. Humiliated, furious, and disgusted were just a few of the colorful choice feelings I was currently experiencing after hearing Mateo's lovely speech. I wanted to reach up right then and there and smack him across his chiseled features, but my body was literally giving out before my eyes. Like, honestly, I don't even know how I was still standing at this point. Look at yourself. I think that became evident to Mateo as he repeated himself just as my knees began to waver on the verge of giving out. He moved his hand down from the wall and gripped the shoulder of my shirt, hoisting me up. This time when he spoke, it actually sounded slightly concerned and way less judge why. I watched as Mateo's dark eyebrows furrowed together almost impatiently as he took in my piteous state. His eyes slowly returned back to their equally unnerving amber color. You're injured. No SHT, Sherlock. I am. I hadn't noticed. I breathed out, my voice was hollow and humorless. I leaned my head back against the brick wall in an attempt to create as much distance between his impossibly close body. Just as quickly as Mateo seemed minutely interested in my well-being, he pushed away from me with a growl, leaving me to support myself alone. Your attitude is going to get you killed, he stated bluntly with his back turned away from me. I scoffed, rolling my eyes. Yeah, well, you would have an attitude too if you were tortured for 3 hours straight in front of a pervy audience. So, fingers crossed. Mateo suddenly stared at me with a bland and rather unamused expression across his brooding features. And this is my fault. How? I waited for Mateo to bust out laughing or something, because I was certain his question was not meant to be taken seriously, but the painful, awkward silence that settled upon us said otherwise. Literally all of this is your fault. Everything here. They are your pack and your men, following your orders, therefore your fault. And he thought I was the stupid one. I pushed myself off of the brick wall and moved to start walking down the alleyway to get away from Mateo and get off of this campus. Mateo lazily sidestepped in front of me, blocking my retreat. You could have just shifted. It would have saved you from, well, all of that. He gestured up and down my battered body with a condescending flicker of his eyes, insinuating that I was to blame again. Recap, I was wolf-less and as good as dead to him. There was no way an alpha, let alone the alpha of the most fearsome packs to ever exist, would take me as a mate or even a prisoner, really. So, I did the only logical thing a person would do in my situation. I hawked another loogie and spat it right in Mateo's face. Mateo stood motionless before me, almost as if he was processing exactly what I had done. I figured I might as well go out with a bang, since this truly was to be my end, and apparently, to me, spitting in assholes' faces was my idea of living large. Despite the terrifying fate that no doubt awaited me at any moment, I found myself beginning to laugh. so much so that I was forced to recline onto my elbows as my sides were aching. Although, now that I think about it, my sides were probably hurting from the extended assault I endured, but I'm going to pretend like it was because of my overwhelming, albeit foolish, joy. Seconds later, I felt hands wrapping around my ankle. The sharp pain at the contact abruptly halted my laughter and forced me to open my eyes. Mateo silently grabbed me and began to drag me down the school alleyway by said ankle. I bounced against the cement as I twisted, trying to get out of his rough grasp. Mateo was making no effort to look out for me as he yanked me along. He pulled me through several puddles and over many painful footholes in the ground, all the while ignoring my emphatic complaints. Dead silence. That's all I got, and honestly, I couldn't decide what was more terrifying: Mateo all up in my space, snarling and yelling like crazy, or this freakishly quiet version of him. He towed me along like this for quite a while. I got to watch our exit from the school campus and the trip down the hill, all from my spot on my back on the ground, still being dragged mercilessly. Upon arriving in the central town, even from my twisted perspective, it was obvious that the Grace Pack was in complete shambles. If I thought what had happened at the school was bad, this was on another level all on its own. Bodies were strewn haphazardly everywhere, so much so that Mateo had to zigzag us through the grown wolves lying on the field, as there was no longer a clear path through the clearing of the town. I felt my throat constricting. I was at face level with my fallen pack members, my body being tugged past them at close proximity, and I saw everything. The fear in their eyes, the slackened jaws, their blood, pain, and suffering. I couldn't breathe. Instinctively, I shut my eyes, trying to block out the horrific scene of what used to be my home. I was not accustomed to this brutality. I'd never been given the opportunity. Sure, I trained with the pack, but I never once actually fought. No wolf meant no fighting, which trapped me inside the Grace Pack for my entire life. It was sheltered and boring. I always longed to be off with the other warriors defending the pack and fighting, but now I was face to face with reality, and it made me sick. Finally, Mateo came to a stop and unceremoniously dropped my battered ankle. Again, more silence. I refused to open my eyes. I knew whatever way he was going to off me had to be happening any second now, and I didn't want to see it coming. However, when Mateo's foot swiftly connected with the side of my ribs, my eyes flew open on their own accord. I peered incredulously up at the monster, but he was not looking at me. His eyes were trained upwards towards the top of our border fence. My own brown eyes followed his gaze to a sight that terrified me even more than the field, something that I thought was impossible. At the top of the fence, resting on the posts, were the heads of our alpha and beta. My jaw trembled as I clutched at the icy grass and desperately tried to crawl away from the scene before me, shutting my eyes again as I attempted to dart away from the disturbing picture. I think she's dead. She can't be dead. She's clearly still breathing, moron. It's been a week now. I think it is safe to say that even if she was still breathing, she can be dead. That doesn't even make any sense. Death doesn't have to make sense. My eyes were closed, but I could suddenly hear two voices bickering back and forth begin to register. As I was able to hear their voices, I was also able to start to feel again, and my entire body was exceptionally sore, and my eyes felt like 1,000,000 tons were weighing them down. It was like I was slowly emerging from this dense fog and stepping into the light. I groaned as I attempted to open my eyes from my coma-esque state of sleep. The pair of voices gasped aloud. I told you she wasn't dead. That was the first voice I heard earlier, a girl's voice. Shut up, Francis. And that had to be the other voice I heard. This was the guy she'd been arguing with. We need to call Healer Maina, Amias. The girl, Francis, I think, instructed quickly. As she spoke, I felt a hand gently touch my wrist, pressing against my vein to take my pulse. Amias, I definitely recognized that name. He scoffed loudly. I'm a healer in training. I think Francis must have whacked him because Amia's voice was cut off after I heard a thud of contact. Exactly, you're still in training. So, until you're not in training, go get Healer Maina. Amias grumbled under his breath and stomped out of the room. It was then when I found the ability to pry my eyes open. The searing light from the room flooded my vision and immediately made me regret my efforts. I tried to push myself up off of the surface. I found myself lying on when I realized that it was a bed that I was on. I was in a bed in a room that very much resembled a hospital room. Where the hell am I? My voice came out coarse like a bizarre combo of a prepubescent teenaged boy eating sandpaper. It caused Frances to flinch and spin around to face me, shock evident across her features as she stared down at me wide-eyed. Frances stayed there like that, just looking at me in shock for a few seconds longer before she regained control of her composure. She cleared her throat. Her lanky figure looked strange in the small room, only adding to the discomfort I was sensing. "My name's Frances. I'm your guard here." I furrowed my brow and once more attempted to adjust myself into a sitting position, and when I failed because my body was still operating sluggishly, I threw my hands up in frustration, only to have them be roughly yanked back down. I stared down at my wrists, noticing for the first time slender metal cuffs encircling each of my hands with the other end being attached to the sides bed. When I looked back up at Frances, her eyes darted away from mine, obviously not wanting to have the conversation as to why I was chained to the Mother F.C. King Hospital bed. Guards, even in my pack, were never much talkers. Naturally, I was literally about to lose my SHT when the door to the room was thrown open and a very angry Mateo stormed into the small space. He was followed by a tiny, older woman who immediately went over to me and began poking and prodding at my various injuries. Francis took the opportunity to skirt out of the room. His fury was met equally by my own. With every fiber of my being, I hated him, but Mateo ignored my silent fuming and turned towards the woman. "I want her back under, Maina." He growled out as he paced at the foot of the bed, ignoring me completely. No, Mateo refused my proposition as I'd expected. It was just too easy. Absolutely not. My father had been missing since I was young, he had been everything, and then one day he simply vanished into thin air. He was basically the third in command within the pack, and while there was not an official title for my father's position, his importance was quintessential to Grace Pack. Our Alpha Lorcan sent out countless search parties for him, working tirelessly to solve the mystery of his disappearance. It went on like this for the next few years, mission after mission to look for my father until one year, the search parties stopped going out. My father slowly slipped out of memory and I was placed into a group home within the pack. People moved on and so did I. I had to. I mourned him as if he had passed away because that was what helped me go on every day. It put an end to my constant state of hoping. I couldn't keep reopening my deepest wound over and over again, so I accepted that wherever my father had vanished to, he would not be making a return trip. It had been almost 15 years since then, with absolutely no sign of my father, and while I missed him terribly, I was in a good place with it all. So when Mateo propositioned me, I knew that this would be the perfect request. It was an impossible task. After all, my pack searched for my father for years with no luck. He could either refuse, which meant I was off the hook, or he could go along, and it would eventually drive Mateo mad. More importantly, either option would mean he would lose his wolf, a punishment I thought seemed pretty apt considering what he did to my pack and me. Was it bad that I was using my potentially dead father as a way to PSS off my evil, psychopathic mate? Maybe. But for the first time since encountering Mateo, I finally felt like I had the upper hand. I swung my legs over the side of the bed with a small smile and stood up for the first time in a week. I was a little unstable and sore, but after a moment of focusing, I felt confident enough to slowly cross the room and face Mateo. "Then I suppose I should welcome you," I announced with a bright smile. His dark features furrowed. "What the FCK are you on about?" I shrugged and clasped my hands in front of me. This had to be the most satisfying moment of my entire life. "Well, if you're not going to help me find my father, then I guess I should welcome you into the Wolfless Werewolf Club." His eyes immediately darkened as they narrowed into furious little slits, and yet I still carried on. "We meet every day because, well, we don't have a wolf anytime. Currently we only have one other member, but with your addition, our numbers will be growing steadily. Our symbol is a really sad person crying because it totally sucks to not be able to shift and enough." Mateo roared and effectively stopped my incoherent rambling. "I'll help you find your father, and in return you help me fix the bond." I nodded absent-mindedly as I toyed with the Roman forecord attached to my arm before resolving to tug it out. MHM, sure thing. The beeping of my heart rate also silenced as I pulled the monitor off too. As I stood in front of the large and rather foggy mirror in the bathroom, I carefully examined my body. I wanted to make sure that when I ran tonight, I wouldn't die as a result of any residual injuries still healing. I was not a pretty picture, that was for sure. Bruises in various states of healing littered and discolored my skin, and the few flesh wounds were only just beginning to scab up. While my body was accustomed to this kind of treatment since I was often accosted within my own pack, I'd still never managed to get used to the sight. I left the bathroom and fished out underwear and clothes to slip on from the meager cardboard box of my things. When I finished changing, I dug through the rest of the box to figure out what I could and couldn't take with, because I knew whatever I brought needed to be light. I was already significantly slower than other werewolves, which meant I needed every bit of help I could find. Using the backpack Matteo had originally intended to be used for our trip, I shoved a few changes of clothes and some toiletries from the bathroom, packing only the necessities for when I ran. I stared down at the bag with a furrowed brow. It was strange how suddenly all of my earthly belongings fit into such a small pack. Not allowing myself any real time to delve into those kind of thoughts, I quickly tied my wet hair back in a braid before I made my way over towards the door to the room. I wasn't stupid, and I knew Matteo was not either. He would have posted a guard at my door. But since there was no window in the room, the door was my only option. I could do this. I could totally do this. With that, I flung the door open and put on my best petrified face, which in reality was fairly easy considering I had been in a constant state of terror since last week. When I stepped into the hallway, I was immediately face to face with none other than Eyeless, or I guess I need to start calling him by his name now. Asa, I suppose. I wanted to instinctively back away from his hulking figure, but if there was any chance of me surviving this, I knew being intimidated would do nothing for me. I was speechless for a moment before I gathered myself and pointed inside of the room. THTH, there's someone in the bathroom. Asa stared into the room past me, completely puzzled. He was no doubt suspicious of my declaration. A man, I clarified rapidly. There was a big man in the bathroom watching me. With that final bit of information, Asa wandered cautiously into the room and I followed behind him. He stepped into the bathroom and checked behind the door. He stopped in front of the shower before roughly shoving the curtains aside. There was nothing there. He frowned immediately and turned to look over at me, but I was already slamming the door locked shut. You crazy BTCH, unlock this door right now. Asa roared out, but I wasn't paying him much mind as I scrambled to throw my backpack over my shoulders and leave the room as quickly as possible. Time was of the essence now. Ignoring his constant strain of curses directed towards me, I slipped out of the main room, locking this door behind me as well. That would mean 2 doors he would need to break through before he could alert anyone. That would buy me at least a few minutes of a head start. I didn't care about being quiet at this point as I tore down the stairs of the 3rd floor. The only thing I could think of was how close I was to being free. When I reached the 2nd level, I could see the front door, and just the sight of it alone almost made me want to cry out of pure joy. It was like I was running with blinders on as I reached the bottom of the staircase. I couldn't see anything other than that beautiful exit. I couldn't see anything, including the muscular arm that had propped itself across the banister and the wall blocking the way. My neck collided squarely with the limb, sending me flying down to the floor at the foot of the stairs. It successfully knocked the breath out of me, leaving me gasping like an idiot on the floor as Matteo leered over me from above. He scowled down at me. I moved my new to try and get up again, but with a roll of his eyes, he simply poked my shoulder and sent me back down. Asa came running down the stairs looking like a nervous, wild man as he took in the scene before him. Matteo looked up from me. He narrowed his eyes up at Asa for a split second. It was as if he was trying to decide who he should deal with first. Incompetent, brutish henchman or attempted escapee mate. With a small, dismissive wave of his hand, Asa retreated back up the stairs. Attempted escapee mate it was then. Just as I managed to sit up, Matteo crouched down in front of me, his orange eyes scanning over every inch of my face like it was the very first time he was ever seeing me. His hand reached out and I flinched, expecting a hard blow, but he softly traced the side of my cheek. His fingers ran down the side of my neck, stopping at the spot where it connected with my shoulder. I realized that at some point during my fall, my shirt had shifted considerably, leaving my shoulder and a lot more of my chest than I would have preferred visible. It was also the first time Matteo was seeing me not freshly beaten to a pulp or in a hospital gown. His eyes darkened as he traced my collarbone, but when Matteo continued lower, I was harshly pulled out of the haze that had temporarily shrouded us, and I slapped his hand away. His black eyes blazed into mine as if he was daring me to challenge him like that again. My breath hitched when suddenly Matteo leaned even closer to me. My back pressed painfully against the last star, and suddenly his lips were grazing my ear. "I want to hurt you so bad right now." He rasped against my skin, his entire face practically engulfed in my hair from his close proximity. I involuntarily gasped, and a dark chuckle rumbled lowly from his chest. He suddenly lightly bit down on the shell of my ear, and I felt a strange sensation resonate into the very core of my being. "It would be easy. You are so fragile." With one final deep inhale, Matteo pulled away from me, and I was finally able to breathe again. My chest was rising and falling haphazardly. I didn't understand what had happened or what I had felt. It had all been so foreign to me. He stood up and tugged me to my feet by pulling on my backpack and planting me on the steps of the stairs. With defeated hopes of escaping and bizarrely unstable legs, I got his message and trudged back up the stairs. Matteo followed me the entire way up, watching me intensely even as I stepped through the broken wooden remains of the door back into the confines of the room. Once I was inside, I expected him to post another guard and call it a night, but Matteo leaned his back against the opposite hallway wall and stationed himself directly outside of my room. He pushed his dark hair off of his face and smirked upon seeing my shocked reaction. He crossed his arms and settled in for the night. Sweet dreams. Oh, I want to dedicate this chapter to the Derp Knight if the tag worked, but to the Derp Knight for being the first reader to actually take a genuine interest in this book. It means a lot, Suo. Please go check out her page because her writing is spectacular. Kim Jaspers is the gal in the banner at the top. She is who I picture Olive to look like, but honestly, if you have another interpretation, I'd love to see it. Hope everyone is having a lovely day. We hit the vote count, so know we'll be updating again. When we hit 50 votes, 3xxq every time I cracked my eyes open or peeked out form under the covers, I had a pair of glowing amber eyes staring directly at me. Matteo's gaze was so intense and unwavering. It was as if he was burning through me and into my soul. "I want to hurt you so bad. It would be easy." Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. When I heard Matteo enter my room, my eyes snapped open and I jolted out up from the bed. He picked up my pack off of the ground and tossed it into my lap. "We leave in 5. And then I was alone. I let out a soft breath as I stood from the bed and tugged on jean shorts and a simple shirt before slipping on my sneakers and heading out of the room. My hands were shaking as I smoothed the front of my shirt down once I made it down the stairs and into the front room of the mansion. I wasn't alone anymore. Amias and Francis stood by the front door with backpacks similar to mine. As much as I wasn't fond of anyone in this pack so far, it was definitely a relief knowing that I wasn't going to be stuck on my own with Matteo for days on end. They both looked over at me. Francis didn't look too pleased to see me, but Amia's eyes immediately lit up. "Olive." I rubbed my arm awkwardly before giving him a small wave. "Hey, Francis." Amias. I took a deep breath. I didn't know you two would be coming. Amias opened his mouth to enthusiastically respond, but Francis swooped in. "First off, I don't go by Francis, it's Fran." "Cool, she hates me." "Lovely." "Second, we weren't supposed to come, but healer Maina has a bunch of people to tend to, so she sent me. Her best student, obviously, and then Fran is here because something came up with Asaz, so now, instead of having the best warrior in the pack, we are stuck with the second best." Amias teased his friend and nudged her with his elbow, but it didn't get much of a reaction from her. I knew what happened to Asaz as I recalled the events of last night on the staircase. This was such a different version of Fran than I remembered from when I was waking up, but then again, I was still pretty doped up on sedatives, so I can't think too much on it. What was particularly interesting was how different members of this pack seemed to be. Usually, Packs all had the same type of people, more or less. But so far in Malice, there are brutish and terrifying wolves, and then there are some like Amya's who are light-hearted and not scary to look at. It was perplexing, and I would have to do some investigating on that. Amya's dropped his elbow that was still poking into Fran's side at the time and immediately straightened. I frowned and turned around to see what changed his mood. It was Mateo, of course. His dark hair was pushed messily off of his face, and he wore dark jeans and a black long-sleeve shirt that he pushed to his elbows. I'm sure if he hadn't destroyed my pack, murdered people, and kidnapped me, I would have found him to be attractive. But seeing that Mateo had done all of those things and so much more, his appearance only gave me fear. I wasn't some damsel in distress who was going to let him off of the hook for his monstrous atrocities just because he was hot as FCK. Mateo didn't say a word to anyone as he walked past the three of us and through the front door. I stood staring at his back, wondering how he could be so arrogant all of the time when Fran cleared her throat and gave me a soft nudge. Recap, he pinned my hands above my head. My arms were overextended, causing an unpleasant pain, which led my back to arch to try and relieve the pressure on me shoulders. This was not that sexy moment where the two lovers passionately battled with their bodies with bated breath amidst a forested field. It was the exact opposite of that. With every fiber of my being, I hated the man on top of me, and yet in that moment, with my body pressing painfully in his, Mateo's lips were suddenly crashing down against mine. Mateo was kissing me. His lips forcefully requested entrance. They asked me to melt into him and forget everything. Mateo beckoned me with his body. I felt his tongue graze across my lower lip before he took it between his teeth, and that was when the fervorous haze that had been clouding my better judgment cleared. This was not right. Mateo was a psychopath, and I wasn't going to allow him to use me like this. He was much too heavy for me to push off, and as I turned my head away, searching for some kind of escape, his kisses moved to my neck. I was all too aware of the closeness of our bodies. Using that vulnerability against him, I threw up my knee into his crotch. Mateo rolled off of me almost immediately, hunching over in pain. I took the opportunity to scramble away from him, my hands unintentionally grabbing fists full of grass as I pushed away towards the opposite side of the clearing. "Stay the FCK away from me, you sick piece of..." He had rolled onto his back and was laughing. It was this bizarre outburst of humor that silenced my tirade. I narrowed my eyes over at him. He must truly be sick in the head, because no normal person would behave the way he has and be laughing about it. I watched as Mateo pushed himself up off the grass, admittedly a little slower than usual. He was grinning as he brushed the dirt from his pants, turning towards me and offering me that same toothy smile. Well, it was worth a shot, right? Half of the times Mateo spoke to me, I had no idea what he was saying to me, and the other half, I was concerned, completely petrified, so this was a good blend of the two sides. "What are you talking about?" My voice tired, but there was a certain kind of sharpness to it, a demanding intonation. Mateo walked towards me, but I quickly started backing away from him again. He stopped promptly and held his hands up slightly. "Anger doesn't cut it for you, so I tried a different tactic to get your wolf to come out. I was on my feet in an instant, so you thought it would be a good idea to what?" Surprise FCK me in the middle of a field and fingers crossed, hope my wolf turned up. He rolled his eyes with a light scoff. "You think I wanted to have sex with you? Don't flatter yourself, this was purely professional. We can now cross off anger and lust as two ways to get you to turn. You should be thanking me, really." "Thanking you?" I couldn't help myself as I let out a roar of irritation as I stomped towards him. "You are insufferable, no, you know what? You are whatever is worse than insufferable, that's what you are. And do you want to know something else? I've kissed better. You were like kissing an old jellyfish, so maybe that's why your stupid little test thing didn't work out." It was a lie. Well, sort of. I hadn't kissed anyone prior to Mateo, so I didn't really know any better, as if my life couldn't get any more pathetic. Mateo opened his mouth, but the sound of a twig snapping forced his attention away from me. Fran and Amya's were frozen, peeking out from behind a tree. "I told you to not make any noise. It was getting good." Fran grumbled quietly as she brushed past Amya's and returned to the clearing, as if they hadn't been listening in to the entire ordeal from behind a tree. Amias chose to ignore Fran's foul mood and approached me smiling with his arms full of various plants and roots. Dinner is served. He plopped down onto the grass with his legs crisscrossed and started eating. Don't worry, everything is safe to eat. We had to learn an entire chapter on edible and medicinal plants in my training. I twined my hands through my hair, allowing myself to be overwhelmed for 1 second. Everything was moving all around me at such a fast pace. 1 minute I was screaming at Mateo, and the next, I'm about to eat a forest salad with one of my captors. Fran and Mateo were sitting off on the other side of the clearing talking about who knows what. I sighed softly, removing my hands, and sat beside Amias. Aren't you going to hunt? He shook his head fervently. I'm vegetarian. Amias paused to examine a particular berry before he popped it into his mouth. Besides, plant-based diets are healthier and increase the longevity of one's lifespan. I heard Fran snort from across the field, and when I looked back to Amias, he was just smiling softly to himself. I couldn't help but to think how bizarre of a friendship they shared. I figured since you were sans wolf, Amias gestured to the spread before us, you'd be in the same boat as me or at least appreciate a less gamey option. I wasn't a vegetarian, but Amias was right. Even in my pack, eating always had been a difficult ordeal considering I was the only person who had an aversion to eating the raw meat of a fresh kill. His thoughtfulness warmed me, however. I picked up a leafy green bushel and began munching on it. Soon, the little green pile of edible plants was gone, and so was the sun. Mateo stood from his spot, as if on cue the moment the darkness took over. I'll take the first watch. Get some rest. Fran and Amias looked over at each other, but didn't question Mateo aloud. They walked to the opposite end of the clearing and laid down beside one another. I sat awkwardly still in the middle of the field where Amias and I had been eating. Mateo quirked his brow at the sight of me. Are you just going to sit there all night staring off into space? I shot him a quick glare before I returned to my little rock from before. I curled up on the ground with my back pressing against it. Despite the fact that I hadn't slept hardly at all the night before, and that my body was still healing, I couldn't bring myself to fall asleep. I stayed there completely motionless for what felt like hours, listening to the low hum of the woods, staring at the blades of grass, anything but what I needed to be doing. SHT. I suddenly heard Mateo quietly curse. I looked over expectantly at Amias and Fran, but they were both completely asleep, so they didn't hear anything. Nervously, I slowly rolled over to face the direction where I'd heard Mateo's voice. He was standing with his shirt off, his entire muscled body flexing as if he was under some kind of great, invisible stress. Mateo suddenly let out a breath and punched the nearest tree trunk. He quickly retracted his hand, shaking it out as he examined the damage he'd just inflicted upon himself. That's right. I'd almost forgotten all about that. He wasn't healing properly anymore with his wolf drawing further and further away from him, which meant that Mateo must also be having difficulty shifting now too. After several more attempts with nothing to show, I finally watched Mateo laboriously shift into his wolf. Under the moonless night sky, it was impossible to make out any details of his wolf, and I certainly wasn't going to press my luck by going any closer to investigate more. As if he could hear my thoughts, Mateo's orange eyes flashed over in my direction. Immediately, I snapped my eyes shut, but I knew he had seen me observing his struggling. I waited for a snarling wolf to creep my way, but when I cracked one eye open to peek, Mateo was faced away from me, sitting on his hind legs. I pulled my legs closer to my body and finally allowed myself to succumb to sleep, not wanting to spend another moment in this day. I had a sneaking suspicion that tomorrow would be equally as taxing, if not more. Thank you for voting and commenting. The support I'm getting for this story is unreal. I'm so happy people are digging this. Next update is going to be at 90 votes. So if you are absolutely dying to know what happens next, let's blow this story up so you guys can get an update ASAP. Normally, I put these things at the bottom, but I couldn't wait. I want to express my gratitude to everyone taking the time to read, comment, and vote on this Lil story. It means so much. I am bipolar, and writing is my way of escaping and expressing myself, so seeing your enthusiasm and interest makes my MFCKN Day 3 as of writing this. We are at 99 votes, so next update will be at 115. Oh, ooh, 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 what do you mean you don't know who they are? I'm not a fighter, Francis. How am I supposed to know the different scents of all the other packs if I've never stepped foot outside our territory? My eyes groggily opened to the sound of Fran and Amia's bickering. It seemed to me that they did lots of arguing when I was unconscious. I sat up from my spot on the grass, rubbing my eyes tiredly as I forced myself to wake up. I watched Fran pinch the bridge of her nose. You've got to tell him. Amia's eyes widened and he shook his head vehemently just as Mateo silently approached them from behind. Tell me what? Amia's jumped while Mateo circled around to face him. He looked like at any given moment Amia's would instantaneously collapse. I may or may not have accidentally crossed the border into another pack's territory. He squeaked out quickly. I woke up early to gather some more supplies for the road, and I found these amazing wild chanterelle mushrooms just on the other side of this stream, so I shifted, and then as soon as I crossed, these wolves surrounded me. I took off, and I don't think they followed me, but Fran still told me to tell you. With every word, Mateo's mood visibly darkened. That is Jack's territory. He growled out, "Noble pack land, they don't just let people go." I stood up and made my way over to them. Who is Jack? All three suddenly turned towards me, noticing my presence for the first time. Jack is the alpha of the noble pack. Mateo rather offhandedly explained to me. I rolled my eyes. Well, no SHT. Fran snorted softly. More like alpha jackass if you ask me. Just as the words left Fran's mouth, two wolves leaped through the foliage and into our clearing. She immediately sucked in a breath as the pair shifted back into their human form, clearly having heard Fran's quip based off of the less than amused expressions they sported. Even I could determine that the first, larger wolf was obviously Alpha Jack. He had insanely blonde hair and blue eyes. It was almost irritating in a way how perfect his features were. The other was a simple wolf, but he still radiated a great deal of presence and authority. Maybe the beta. Can't say I haven't heard that one before. Was every alpha wolf obscenely sarcastic? Were they all or this irritating? Fran instantaneously paled and looked to the floor, while Mateo shot her a quick glare before turning his attention back to the other alpha. We were just passing through. Don't get your panties into a twist. Jack's blue eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Trespassing is the word I think you are looking for. Mateo rolled his eyes and gave a mocking nod, sarcastically agreeing with the noble pack's alpha. I really don't give a SHT about what you want to call it. I just know that you don't want to have a problem with me right now. Being a dick about letting us through, that classifies as having a problem with me right now. I couldn't imagine talking to an alpha the way Mateo was speaking with Jack. Well, I could, considering how I argued with Mateo all of the time, but he didn't really count because I didn't respect him in the slightest. But Alpha Lorcan, he was someone I would have said myself on the spot, right in front of him if I ever spoke that way to him. My eyes flew open and I immediately started thrashing, but I wasn't terribly worried at first because I assumed that this was Mateo and one of his twisted training scenarios. But when I was smacked roughly upside the head, I saw that Mateo was still in bed, only just beginning to stir. How had this man gotten in without Mateo hearing? Certainly, his supernatural senses would have detected an intruder unless his wolf senses were not working to the fullest of their abilities. I was yanked out of the bed, and for a brief second, the intruder's hand slipped and I was able to let out a scream. I did something that surprised myself. I called out for Mateo. He was up in a flash. Mateo appeared as confused as I was about how all of this came to be. Mateo moved to cross the room, but suddenly there was a cold metal piece being pressed against my throat, causing him to immediately stop in his tracks. I had my suspicions in the clearing. You did a good job at masking her scent, but a human, really. I tried to jerk around to see who was gripping me, that the metal only dug further into my neck. I winced as I felt a tiny trickle of blood roll down the side of my neck. Mateo looked completely relaxed. There wasn't a sign of anger or concern anywhere to be seen on his features, nor did he make any move to correct Jack on his assumptions about me. This was the one time I actually needed Mateo to be angry, to do something, and he just stood there casually. Let her go, Jack. Alpha Jack. His voice coldly resounded in a shrill laugh. You don't get to trespass on my land and then undermine me in front of a member of my pack. That's just not how things work. You understand. I recalled Mateo's words from when Amia's first alerted him about the situation. They don't just let people go. I just find it rather humorous, the legendary alpha of malice getting stuck with a defenseless human for a mate. It's the ultimate embarrassment for someone like you. No wonder you've done such a diligent job keeping her under wraps. Jack dragged the tip of the knife up the length of my throat, tracing my jawline. I was doing my best to stay cool and not let on how truly scared I actually was, but when I felt the knife graze my cheek, I couldn't help the strangled sob escape my lips. Mateo, please. I whispered helplessly, because right then in the dingy motel room, he was all I had. Hurting her isn't going to restore your pride. We both know that. Why not just let her go and we can settle this between each other? That's what this is all about in the end, really. Mateo ignored the fact that Alpha Jack was holding me at knife point and resumed a slow advance towards us. Jack gripped me tighter, seeing Mateo come closer and closer with every step. Don't you think I know that? But if it means I get to watch you suffer for even a split second, it will have been worth it. Mateo hesitated for a moment, looking over at me for a split second before he shrugged his shoulders. I had the sinking suspicion that this wasn't all about what had taken place earlier. There was something else going on. She's just a human, like you said. Her pain means nothing to me. Go ahead, make me suffer. That was it. Alpha Jack finally had enough with Mateo's little games. He dropped the knife and threw me aside. I landed hard on my side against the hard floor of the motel room, my ribs taking the majority of the blow. In seconds, both Mateo and Jack were shifted into their wolves and snarling wildly at one another. Jack's wolf was a glistening, pure white coloring with those same piercing blue eyes, while Mateo's pelt was a deep brown hue. None of us went back to sleep that night. I don't know if it was the adrenaline still pounding or nerves, but we all spent the remainder of the night sitting on the floor of the battered motel. It was too quiet, almost uncomfortable, but at the same time it felt so right after what happened. The sun began to slowly stream into the room as it crept up into the sky, and with the arrival of the morning, everyone sprung into action. I'll take care of the manager. Amias stood and left the room. Fran pushed off of the ground. I'll gather our things. Mateo nodded, and again we were left all on our own. I stood up from the cold hardwood floor, stretching my limbs out in front of me. I walked in front of the small mirror hanging in the room, and immediately my hand found my throat again. I felt my heart begin to pound terribly in my chest as I recalled the exact feeling of the blade against the fragile skin there. Mateo had gotten up as well. He had been rooting around for one of his shirts in his bag when he saw me from across the room. He immediately dropped the piece of cloth onto the floor, walking over to me, and like he had so many times the night before, he tugged my hands away. I tore my eyes from the slight girl in the mirror and was face to face with a bare-chested Mateo. His hand stroked my cheek, and I found myself leaning into his palm. His touch moved lower to my neck, and I immediately stiffened. Mateo paused over the makeshift bandage. I just want to look at it. True to his word, Mateo slowly unraveled the shred of shirt he fashioned into a wrap for my neck, and I watched him work through our reflection in the mirror. He was a large, shadowy figure next to my small, and at this point, rather pale frame magnifying our differences in the mirror. His nimble fingers carefully peeled the fabric from my skin, ignoring me soft hissing at the slight pain. Mateo examined the horizontal laceration, and based off his lack of reaction, it seemed he was pleased with how it was healing. So much so that he left the wrapping off. No more of the creepy, obsessing over your neck SHT, all right? When I didn't respond, he took my chin in his hand, Olive. His voice was quiet, his eyes were filled with a tangible concern. Mateo must be convinced that I was genuinely losing it, and I was a little worried too. It was the sound of my name on his lips, however, that sent me over the edge. Immediately tears welled up and spilled over down my cheek. Mateo looked horrified and utterly confused as he held my crying face in his hands. I could tell he wanted to let go and leave me to deal with this SHT by myself, but for some reason he forced himself to stay. I was crying over what happened last night. I cried for the situation I found myself in, but primarily, I think I was crying because of the inescapable guilt that was spreading through my being like a wildfire. Amias popped his head into the room, his eyes widening seeing us. We're ready to go whenever. Mateo took his hands off of my tear-stained face as Amia's disappeared. He stood awkwardly in front of me as I continued to cry freely. Mateo reached his hand out and hesitantly placed it on my shoulder, giving it a light pat. It would normally be a painfully uncomfortable move, but from the little I knew about Mateo, it seemed like a big gesture. I sniffled and looked up at him through my soaked lashes with quiet gratitude written across my features, which led him to quickly drop his hand and clear his throat. He ditched me and went back to his bag and finished putting his shirt on. Stop crying. He demanded over his shoulder when he heard me sniff again, and just like that, Mateo was back. He swung his pack onto his shoulders and picked mine off the floor and tossed it over to me, effectively forcing me to snap out of it and get back into focus. I clumsily caught it and slipped it on. I stepped over a couple of the broken pieces of furniture, and then I was walking out of the room and motel. Once we were down, Amias immediately began smiling when he saw us walk through the parking lot towards them. He shot me a wink. I knew he was trying to lighten the mood and be playful, but whatever he thought he saw earlier between Mateo and I simply didn't happen. I couldn't bring myself to smile. Fran frowned. Please tell me that she hasn't really been up there crying. Amias hushed her and threw his elbow into her side, but it was already said. Normally, I would let something like this slide. I was so used to little comments like this. People being mean to me was kind of my daily routine, but for some reason, Fran's words hit a nerve. What's your problem? I stepped away from Mateo and walked towards Fran. What did I do to you to make you hate me so much? Fran looked startled, clearly not anticipating any sort of reaction from me. Frankly, I hadn't been expecting this sort of response from me either. It was right then, in that moment, I decided that I wanted to break my routine. I was tired of allowing people to go along beating and berating me. Mateo was right. I needed to be done doing nothing about my life. Olive, she started, but Mateo's amused laughter from behind us cut both of us off. You should have seen the look on your face. Mateo murmured, obviously entertained, we need to get out of Jack's territory and into Alpha Isabel's land. We'll be safe in the woods there. He looked over at me and smiled. It was lighthearted and easygoing, very unlike him. He pointed north of the town. Her pack gives us easy access. It is directly adjacent to Freeman's land, which means we find Lysander and then I get my wolf back. That's not the only thing about Isabel that was easy access. Amias leaned down and whispered to me. It didn't really make all that much sense, but Amias got the desired point across nonetheless. Mateo glared over at us. What did you just say? Amias looked like he saw the grim Reaper himself in that moment. I was just explaining to our new Luna the complicated, inter-error relations and mingling between the other alphas. He wasn't buying it. Amias had whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, and I couldn't help to wonder if it had been intentional. There's nothing to discuss and quit calling her that. Both Amias and I turned towards each other, mirroring similar looks of confusion. Luna. Mateo growled and dragged a hand through his hair. I wondered how his hair wasn't greasy all the time because he was constantly running his hands all up through it. Yes, that. She's not the Luna. He said it all very matter-of-factly. Not that I cared in the slightest about being the Luna of the Malice pack, but his words caught me off guard. What is that supposed to mean? Mateo hesitated for a moment. He looked annoyed as he pinched the bridge of his nose. This should all be over within the next 2 days, that is what I mean. He turned away from me and began walking, leaving me standing there confused and slightly scared again. 2 days. 48 hours and I was a dead man, for real this time. Mateo would find out that my dad wasn't really actively missing and that I was incapable of reciprocating the bond. That would be it. Fran ignored me and followed dutifully behind Mateo while Amias stayed back with me. He looked ahead to make sure Mateo and Fran were occupied, and once he was satisfied with the distance, he thrusted his hips into the air and made a banging gesture with a wolfish grin. My gaze traveled from Amia's raunchy miming to Mateo's back. Him and Alpha Isabel had been a thing. Oh, so the votes needed for this update was 140, and we are currently at 153. I'm literally screaming thank you, SM. Sorry for the short update, BTW. Next update is going to be at 170. What are your thoughts on Tio and Olive? I want to hear him. This chapter is being dedicated to Obdidava. Thank you for your kind words and enthusiasm. It makes my Liffey also thank you for your patience on this Chapter 3 XXQ. The Ardor Pack was widely recognized for their strong connection to emotion, particularly that of passion and enthusiasm. We were instructed that their wild nature was dangerous. Being as open and passionate as they were could only result in trouble. The more and more I thought about it, everything made sense. Of course, Mateo would be interested in the alpha of the Ardor Pack. Isabel was probably everything he was looking for, and then some. It might be that Isabel's preference was murderers. Maybe that was her thing, but it certainly wasn't not my type. I told myself that I didn't care about Mateo, and that whatever he did with his life, or whoever, would be more accurate, because I truly didn't. Amias walked alongside me and gently nudged me with his elbow. "You're turning green." He did his best to conceal the enormously smug grin from his face, but the effort was poor. I scoffed softly with indignation, hardly. "MHM, sure." Amias nodded sarcastically, clearly not believing my denial. "So, since you're not going to give me a juicy admission of guilt, you're going to have to entertain me some other way." Honestly, every minute I was around Amias, it was more and more difficult for me to believe that he came from malice. He was the exact opposite of never mind. All right, I tucked my dark hair behind my ears. I dimly remembered Amias mentioning to me in the car during our first encounter that he had a mate. "How did you meet your mate?" Instantaneously, Amias' eyes lit up. He struggled to keep himself from bouncing up and down, it seemed. "Felix." He said his mate's name dreamily, breathing it out with a love-struck sigh. It was that cliché moment that every wolf dreams of. Everything was absolute perfection. We met when we're both seniors in high school. These kids were roughing me up and shoving me against a locker, and Felix ran over to my rescue. He pulled them off of me and offered me a hand, and the moment our hands touched, there was this intense spark that ran through my entire being. I knew from then on, I would spend the rest of my life loving that man. There was goodness and hope in this world after all. Certainly not for me, but Amia's wonderful tale of finding his mate was definitely affirming to the rest of the population who weren't facing impending doom. "That's magical, Amias. I am so happy for you." His giddy smile faltered for a split second. It was like Felix and I were on cloud 9 until the rest of our pack kicked us out after they discovered we were together and in love. Immediately I glared over at Mateo's back. "He kicked you out for being gay." I knew Mateo was bad. No doubt one of the most awful people walking the earth, but that was definitely an all-time low for him. Amias quickly shook his head and signaled for me to lower my voice. "What?" No, Alpha Mateo took us in when no one else would. He gave us a home in Malice. He picked up on my confusion easily. Alpha Mateo gave us all homes. He took us all in. All. I asked slowly, but things were falling into place on their own. It made sense, really. That would explain why everyone in Malice seemed so drastically different from one another. Amias slung an arm around my shoulders. "Sure, there are some original Malice members, but once Alpha Mateo was voted in Alpha, he opened his pack to those in need and created a stronger Malice pack with a diverse population of wolves form all packs and walks of life." It was an explanation, but it did nothing to help alleviate my questions. "Has he not told you any of this?" I shook my head. "Alpha wasn't born a true alpha wolf. We vote on our alphas in Malice. He was just an ordinary wolf with an eye for strategy and a soft spot for those in need until he was voted into power. Ever since then, he's easily become the greatest alpha in Malice history, certainly the greatest wolf I have ever encountered." Amias continued on and on about how great Mateo was. It was as if he was conveniently forgetting what Mateo was really known for. Everyone in the room collectively sucked in a nervous breath. You could cut the tension in the air with a knife. Mateo looked like at any given moment he was going to spring across the table and strangle me to death in front of everyone. Amias and Fran just looked like they wanted to be anywhere other than here and Isabel. She was off in her own world entirely. The snarky nature of my words was entirely lost on her. She offered me a bright smile as she eagerly nodded at me. "Precisely, Olive." She leaned forward the table, looking at all of us with that same mischievous smile. "Except there's a small twist." She swept up one of the bubbling pink drinks with a flourish and held it in front of us all. "This is called La Boisson de l'Ardeur, the drink of ardor, and it has magical powers. This time it wasn't me who wasn't having it, Franz snorted. Magical powers. Isabel continued to nod. What you all just drank is no ordinary beverage. It enables a person to be their most true self. Free of inhibitions and free of dishonesty, it allows for complete candor and empowers a person to embrace their emotions and feelings as is the Ardor way. You drugged us. Amyas exclaimed and immediately set his drink down onto the table. She laughed, her voice coming out like delicate little bells. But of course, my eyes rested on Matteo, giving him an exasperated look. I couldn't believe he was so blasé about everything Isabel was doing. He stared back at me, daring me to open my mouth and say something, but I quickly dropped my gaze. We are our best selves when we embrace our emotions. These Ardor nights help attune oneself to our ways of life. Isabel clarified as she herself took a sip from a cup that, unlike ours, was not transparent. I don't like you. The words fell out of my mouth before I totally recognized what was happening, but I couldn't stop myself. The thoughts had been pried from my subconscious and thrown out. That must be where the fact or fiction came into play. I expected Isabel to lose her composure after my candid outburst, but she just kept on smiling at me with that same creepy, jovial attitude. Looks like the fun is beginning. I heard someone cough out that I was a lightweight, but in the crowd of stiffs I found myself in, it was obvious the culprit was Amyas. That and the fact that he was covering his face with his hands trying to stifle his laughter, it appeared that I wasn't the only one feeling the effects of the cocktail. I'll start. Isabel looked around our small group. Matt, big surprise there. Matt, fact or fiction? She leaned forward, holding her head in her hands. As a result of her shift, Isabel's blonde hair moved away from her shoulders and displayed her neck where she sported a fresh-looking bite mark. She was mated. For the first time in our time here in Ardor, Matteo, for a split second, looked slightly uncomfortable. Welcome to my world. He rolled his shoulders and leaned away from the table, moving his eyes away from the juncture of her neck and shoulder. I took this strange moment of silence to down the rest of my drink. I was going to need every drop of this to get through tonight. Fiction. He ran his hand across his jaw before he too took another long sip from his drink, but if it was affecting him at all, he was doing a good job at hiding it. I was already struggling to maintain consciousness. The entire journey back up the stairs to my room was a nauseating blur. Matteo had somehow managed to get me back in one piece into my room, with the only casualty being his shoes. Once inside, Matteo propped up my noodle body against the bedpost and disappeared for a few minutes into the bathroom. I heard water running from behind the closed door. I wrapped my arms around the wooden pole and held on for dear life as the room was spinning all around me. I suddenly remembered why I never drank back at home. This was by far the worst feeling ever. The worst and the best. I couldn't get Amyas Lady Gaga song out of my head, so to kill time I had been humming it, but when Matteo returned into the room, the stern look on his face piped my humming down considerably. He extended his hand to me, and I made the short walk over to him without making too much of a fool of myself. He snorted lightly. "You're walking like a baby deer," Matteo informed me as he added a hand to my lower back to help steady me. "We got into the bathroom and the tub was filled up. We've got to sober you up. Get in." I nodded sarcastically and folded my arms across my chest, like I was just going to casually strip in front of him and trust Matteo to be a gentleman and not sneak a peek. Right. Like usual, it was almost as if Matteo was holed up inside of my head reading my each and every thought. "Relax. You can keep your clothes on. Just get in." I'd never heard that sitting in a bathtub full clothed could help sober someone up, but then again, I didn't really make it a point to get drunk off of magical emotion cocktails on a regular basis. Hesitantly, I stepped into the tub and sunk into the warm water. It felt lovely, and surprisingly enough, it actually did make the pounding and swirling in my head more tolerable. Tucking my knees to my chest, I rested my head atop of my legs and looked up at Matteo from my little perch in the water. Seeing that I was secure and seemingly stable for the moment, Matteo turned away towards the door. "Wait," I called after him, leaning over the bathtub side trying to reach out to him. "I don't want to be alone." Obviously, because it was dangerous to leave a drunk person unattended, obviously. He quirked an eyebrow skeptically over at me as I gestured him to join me in the bathtub by patting the toasty water. If you don't come in, I'm just going to come out, so either way, fine. Just stop talking. Mateo grumbled and ambled into the tub, sitting on the opposite side from me. As far away from me as humanly possible in the enclosed space, just the way I liked it. He leaned his back against the wall of the bathtub and rested his arms along the sides. He closed his eyes in complete relaxation. When he was like this, he appeared so serene and boyish. Without all of the scowling and rudeness, there was an angelic peace to him. I recoiled at my own thoughts. Mateo was hardly angelic, and peace was the last thing on his mind. Just because he looked cute when he was trying to cut loose didn't change his integrity, which reminded me, you were an asshole tonight. I informed him sweetly as I sunk lower into the water, allowing my shoulders to slip underneath the surface. Mateo cracked an eye open. Is that so? I bristled at his careless attitude. Yes, that is so. I mocked back. You sucked tonight, and it really sucked having to watch you and your girlfriend make goo-goo eyes at each other all night. Well, I finally said it. His entire body stiffened, loosing that carefree, relaxed look from seconds ago. Isabel is not my girlfriend. I rolled my eyes and gave a singular nod. Well, not yet, but it's obvious you want her to be, and that wasn't all that fun. I muttered under my breath as I folded my arms across my chest. I was being childish. Even in my receding state of intoxication, I could tell, but did that stop me from being a brat about it? Nope. While the whole soak in a bathtub to sober up thing actually worked, it didn't do anything to alleviate the excruciating hangover I woke up with in the morning. It also didn't mitigate the crushing guilt and humiliation I was experiencing either, so FCKU, ardor and your fancy magic drinks. I felt like death or whatever was worse than that. When I managed to pull myself out of bed, on my way to the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror, and I thought it was someone breaking into the room. It wasn't a pretty picture. Knowing what awaited me downstairs, I took my sweet time as I got ready for the day, but it wasn't like I really had a choice in the matter. My body physically would not allow me to move quickly without feeling that ominous feeling right before you are about to yak. I didn't want to chance it, so I went at my own pace. It also offered me a convenient excuse to prolong seeing Mateo for as long as possible. Once I was finished procrastinating, I crept out of the room with my bag in tow, only peeking my head out at first, just in case. Immediately when I opened the door completely, light streamed in through the room, causing me to wince at the sharp pain the rays created. I looked away from the light, and to my side, I saw that Amias was just emerging from his room as well and was in a similar position as I was, trying desperately to escape the painful lights. Fran stepped around the both of us with a roll of her eyes as she flicked her long, dark hair over her shoulder. Lightweights. She taunted in a sing-song voice that was just a little too loud for comfort. Amias flipped her the bird, but his motions were sluggish too, so Fran didn't even have a chance to see it. It's official, he announced as he reached my side and we began to walk down the stairs together. Last night was the pits. I quirked my eyebrow over at him. The pits. He nodded and grasped my forearm for balance as he teetered on one of the stairs, like an armpit. It sucked. I couldn't agree with him more. I wanted to spill my guts to Amias and have someone listen to the turmoil that was taking place in my head, but I held my tongue. I knew if I told him, I would never hear the end of it, so I'd rather just suffer in silence. As we reached the bottom of the staircase, I saw Mateo conversing with Fran by the front door with their bags set on the floor right beside them. Amias and I meandered through the remarkably quiet foyer of the mansion over to them. Mateo wouldn't look at me. Fran stared between Mateo, and I automatically sensing the tension between us. She tilted her head towards me slightly, but I shook my head. I knew it wasn't much, but that small questioning gesture warmed my heart. Fran actually bothered to check in on me. The four of us just stood in silence around the entrance. Amias started letting out an exceptionally large huffs of air to purposely accentuate the awkwardness of the situation. I was about to finally break under the painful quiet and strike up some boring small talk when a door from behind us creaked open. Alpha Isabel entered the room first. She looked different from last night, stronger and more confident. I don't know what changed overnight, but she certainly embodied the traditional regal alpha look now. A half second later, a large guy followed through the doorway right behind her with his hand wrapped protectively around hers. This must be the mate she mentioned last night. I couldn't help myself as I looked over at Matteo, and he was looking right back at me, not at Isabel, but at me. He frowned as I quickly dropped my gaze away from him. Matteo stepped through us and walked towards Isabel and her mate, but a low growl from her counterpart halted Matteo. At first he appeared in shock that someone would speak to him that way, but then there was a clear understanding between them that happened silently and almost instantaneously. He nodded once, rubbing his jaw as if he had just been punched. "Congratulations on your bonding." Matteo finally breathed out, and unlike last night, his words actually came out genuine. Freeman's Land, home to the mysterious Lysander, definitely lived up to its name. It looked like the aftermath of some teenaged rave in the middle of the woods. There was debris and evidence of chaos everywhere. This new land was unquestionably intriguing, however. I still hadn't fully digested the situation that just unfolded only minutes ago with Isabel. It was just like swimming on a full stomach. It was bad to jump into the deep end without allowing your stomach time to mull over what was just consumed. I didn't want to open a whole new world of questions when I already had enough swarming around in my head as it was. I twined my hands through my hair as I leaned against the nearest tree trunk. Does anyone want to explain to me what just happened? All eyes were suddenly on Matteo. He shoved his hands into his pockets and shrugged his shoulders. "She's obviously a lunatic. That's all you need to know." I laughed and dropped my arms dramatically. "You've got to be kidding me." I pushed off of the tree and stalked towards Matteo with an accusatory finger pointed at his chest. That psychotic woman just went absolutely postal on me. She wanted to keep me in her lands and try and turn me. "You're going to have to give me a better answer than that, bull." Matteo narrowed his eyes at my rude finger and lazily batted it away with a small wave of his hand. "We don't have time for one of your breakdowns, Olive," he condescendingly remarked as he stepped around my fuming frame. "One of my what?" As his back was turned away from me, I impulsively reached out and shoved him. "Tell me what happened," I demanded, but Matteo didn't stumble or lose his footing. His entire body just went still. Fran and Amias collectively sucked in a breath, and I thought I might have even seen a vein popping out in Matteo's neck. When Matteo finally turned around to face me, I did my best to hold my chin high and pretend that I wasn't scared out of my wits. His eyes were dark, and suddenly he was advancing towards me, sending me scrambling backwards, trying to keep the safe distance between us. He stopped his menacing progression as if he could feel the confusion in the air, looking away from me and to the rest of the group who looked equally interested in hearing his response. Isabel turned me. I don't know how many others, but I know that I wasn't the first and clearly was not the last. Matteo announced. I knew she had turned others, but now I know that saving and helping is the last thing on her mind. She's gone completely unhinged. His infuriated demeanor melted away as he dragged a hand through her hair, appearing equally frustrated by this new knowledge. Her pack is one of the oldest. They have ancient magic that not many wolves know how to access anymore. The only reason that Isabel would have an interest obsession. I chimed in, finding a better fitting word. Right. The only way I can even begin to explain her obsession would be because she is doing this all for someone else. Someone above her is using her, orchestrating this all for their own benefit. Matteo was thinking aloud, pacing before us. He didn't understand exactly what was happening. An alpha not in total control of the situation was refreshing, I'm not going to lie. Amias snapped his fingers together as he came to a sudden realization. I bet she's working with that vampire rogue dude, Lysander, to turn people for him. The blood instantly left my face. Vampire king dude Lysander. I grit out between my clenched jaw as I glowered at Matteo, who looked like he was going to wring Amia's neck. This entire time you've conveniently left out that the man you are leading me towards isn't really a man, but is a blood-sucking monster. I moved to shove Matteo again, but he caught my hands and pinned them together in front of me. I would advise you not to do that again, he warned lowly, his grip tightening and ever so slightly becoming painful. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. I exclaimed as I wildly thrashed in his grasp. I don't want anything to do with you, and if that means you lose your wolf, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make, because I can't trust a single thing you've ever said or done. Everything was eerily quiet after my declaration. I was heaving from the exertion it took to utter those words before him. I glanced around, and as soon as I came to rest on Fran and Amia's, they turned around and made themselves sparse. They could sense the impending outburst. Mateo stared down at me. His gaze was menacing and cold. There was nothing, only a burning anger that was directed entirely upon me, but surprisingly enough, he dropped my hands. This is about last night. It wasn't a question, instead. He arrogantly stated it like some kind of fact. Of course he would assume that. I narrowed my eyes and shook my head. You've got to be kidding me. Last night? Nothing happened between us. I folded my newly freed arms across my chest. A wicked grin spread across Mateo's face. I never said anything about us, Olive. You brought that up all on your own. You're mental. I denied. My face was turning red. I could just feel it. He shook his head, savoring my discomfort. I think you are embarrassed over your wild display of affection last night. Mateo tainted cruelly, I think. It's that embarrassment and your crippling remorse that is fueling this temper tantrum of yours. My nostrils flared in anger. I had to use all of the restraint to keep myself from launching forward and attacking him. You are mistaken. Mateo scoffed and nodded sarcastically at me. Sure I am. Care to explain? Neglecting to tell me that Lysander is a vampire. That is messed up on so many levels, Mateo. Surely you can understand that. Vampires were such a rare occurrence nowadays. They had been driven into reclusion with the exponential growth of wolf packs in the area. Since they were so rarely seen, it was easy to forget their deadly nature and how much trouble they could really cause for a werewolf. I hadn't forgotten, however. These beasts were murderers who preyed on the innocent and stalked the weak. They were cold-hearted and callous, only caring for themselves. Inflicting pain was something they enjoyed. It was all just some sick game to them. Sounds a lot like someone else I know. All you do is manipulate me and play with my head. I'm not some doll you can pick up and play with, and then, when you are bored, just toss me aside for later. I watched him furrow his brow. I didn't know if that was a good sign or troubling. One minute you hate me, the next you want me, and the following day you want to kill me. It's maddening, Mateo, and I'm done being your little chew toy. His eyes were looking at the tree beside me, not meeting my gaze. Mateo looked uncomfortable again, just like he had in the bathroom right before I started crying. Bursting forth, Mateo suddenly moved towards me. He caught my face in his hands and tried to kiss me, but I was expecting some kind of move like this. I slapped him, stopping him in his tracks. Mateo dropped his hands. His face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. I felt strong. For the first time in a long time, I actually felt confident. You can't just kiss away the problems here. I stepped away from him. That's not how reality works. He was seething now. It was no longer shock but a burning anguish that I had told him off and had been right. But beneath the rage, I knew he recognized the truth behind what I said. Somewhere inside of him, he had to understand. Oh, Elmao. So we aren't on the charts anymore, but it's all good. It was a beautiful Lil moment while it lasted. Next update is going to be whenever we get to 360 or Saturday night. Whatever comes first. XXQ, thank you to Itspella00 for the cool cover 3. She is a great friend. I'm so glad to have met her. Go check out her writing. Oh, After our little encounter, Mateo and I steered clear of each other and continued on with Fran and Amia's into the new land without another word. It seemed like we were always traveling like this, either in complete silence or outright brawling. There was never an in-between. By the time we reached the central city of Freeman's Land, I understood how the unclaimed territory earned its name. It was chaos personified. People ran wildly through the streets in various states of undress. Fires burned in the trash cans lining the streets. There was screaming and music everywhere I turned. It looked like the modern-day equivalent of the raucous port of Tortuga from Pirates of the Caribbean, complete lunacy. I flinched when a bottle fell from the sky and crashed onto the ground right beside me, shattering into a million different fragments. I glowered up at the second-story apartment window where the bottle hailed from. A clearly intoxicated man sat in the sill singing a song about cheese. Which cheese is the saddest? He crooned sloppily above us, blue cheese because it will forever be provolone. The man drunkenly lost his balance during his big finale and slipped from the step of the window. He sunk to the ground, landing remarkably almost in the exact same spot as the bottle he sent down moments earlier. He wasn't moving or singing anymore, for the matter. Fran stooped down to check his pulse. Her grim expression was the only explanation she needed. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough for Amia's. He too crouched by the man's body to confirm Fran's judgment call, and after a moment he seemed satisfied with her findings as well. We turned away from him, looking around at the packed streets, hoping someone would speak up and claim him, but no one spared the scene a second glance. We can't just leave him here. Amia's fretted. Mateo frowned immediately. Sure we can, and we will be leaving him here. He and his unfortunate alcoholism is none of our concern. Amia's sputtered wordlessly as he looked to Fran or I to back him up. The man is lying dead in the street after serenading us with a cheese song. It would be wrong to leave someone like that. He turned with his arm outstretched to emphasize the condition of the poor man's lifeless body. But when we faced the building again, there was no longer a body. The cheese man had disappeared. Amia's knelt by the glass where the body had just been seconds ago, searching for some indicator or sign that he had been there, but there was nothing. No blood, no body, nothing. Mateo suddenly grabbed my arm and continued down the street with a renewed vigor as he dragged me along. Keep moving. He didn't seem terribly worried, but there was definitely something he knew that encouraged him to leave behind the cheese man mystery. He seemed to know something was not right with the situation. I had to jog every few steps to keep up with Mateo's quickened pace. I was so lost in my thoughts that it was difficult to keep one foot going after the other. Finally, they overflowed into a cathartic release of confused inquiries as he guided us through a series of quick turns and blocks. What is this place? What just happened to that man? Who are these people? Where is Lysander? Why Mateo clamped his hand over my mouth and pulled me down an alleyway with Amia's and Fran in close tow. Only once we reached the end did he remove his hand. I scowled at him and made a dramatic show of wiping my mouth from his touch. Are you going to answer my F-seeking questions now? Devin bursted out into a fit of cold laughter, even going as far as wiping a tear from his ruby eyes. For a second there, I thought you said you were going to kill Lysander. I stared over at Mateo, equally shocked by this mission statement. There was never any mention of killing him. This was the first time I was hearing any of this information. I turned to Fran and Amia's to get validation for my shocked reaction, but they didn't seem surprised at all. Amia's offered me a small apologetic shrug. I didn't want to kill anyone. I never wanted any of this. I had to tell them there was no way I could keep this game up any longer. It was not fair for me to punish Fran, Amia's, and now Devin for Mateo's actions. My father is dead. The whole room suddenly turned towards me. There was a painfully pregnant pause as I waited for the screaming to erupt, but the entire company just turned away from me. Hello. I stood on my tiptoes as I tried to get them to listen. I said my father isn't actually alive. He is long gone. Completely and totally dead, has been for years. I repeated just a little louder this time. I needed their attention as much as they needed to hear this. But they didn't think I was being serious. I finally told the truth, and they wouldn't spare me a second glance. Mateo rolled his eyes and repeated himself over my own voice, trying his best to not give me any encouragement. I'm going to kill him, and you and your coven will be free. He shrugged his shoulders as if it was the simplest thing. Devin shook his head and pointed to the door we'd all just filed in through. That isn't a group of cavalier abolitionists out there. They are terrified and vulnerable. They don't need you to get their hopes up. Terrified vampires. Right. He paused, looking around at us. You really don't know what he's done, do you? Devin didn't wait for a response. Lysander tore us from human lives. He turned us and forced us into his service. He had us commit unspeakable acts on others and our own kind. He turned us into the very monsters everyone wants us to be. The psychological and physical damages we sustained as his slave stays with us every single day. He won't ever let us go, even now when we are away from him. Whether it's our own mind torturing us or his hunters relentlessly tracking us, we go through our own hell repeatedly, minute after minute and day after day. He shook his head once more. Don't go saying things like that around here, Mateo. Don't make a promise you and I both know that you cannot keep. Mateo's jaw ticked. It was clear he was doing his very best to remain civil with someone he considered to be a friend, but it was becoming increasingly more difficult. That much was obvious. I'm losing my wolf. With every day, I feel it draw further away. This is the only way I can restore our connection. My wolf's livelihood rests in my ability to take down Lysander. You can trust me when I tell you that tomorrow you will have Lysander's head on your doorstep. My life depends on it after all. I narrowed my eyes at Matteo. He wasn't telling the whole truth, but then again, neither was I. So I decided that it was not my place to correct him in front of everyone. I also made the decision that I would no longer feel guilty about leading Matteo on this wild goose hunt. I told the truth, so my conscience was clear now, therefore it was no longer my problem. Your wolf is leaving you. Devin looked shocked as he ran a hand through his curly hair. But even if what you are saying is true, you won't be anywhere near Lysander in a day's time. Freeman's land extends beyond this city. It goes for hundreds of miles in every direction, and he is in the very middle of it all. When we stepped out of Devin's room, there were vampires crowded by the door. Their disapproving murmurs rippled through the room as we silently wove our way through the lifeless room. I did my best to appear comfortable, but it was a difficult task. Devin climbed up the first step before pausing and facing the room once more. I'm leaving the annex. He began, and for the first time I saw genuine emotion in his eyes. And when I return, you all will be free from this place and this life. With that, Devin took to the stairs, keeping us in close tow behind. We stepped back into the alleyway, and just as magically as it appeared, the hidden doorway to the annex retreated into the brick wall seamlessly. My fingertips gingerly traced over the rock wall as we walked out of the dark corridor. Matteo cleared his throat next to me and gathered my attention that way. My eyes flickered up to his, and then down to his hand, which was outreached towards my own in a silent offering. And I took it. Quietly, I slipped my hand into Matteo's, and we walked together hand in hand, as if it was something the both of us were completely comfortable with. The reality was that Matteo and I were the farthest thing from comfortable with each other, or even amicable with one another, but this small gesture somehow felt right. In the moment at least. Once we were out of the alley, the chaos of Freeman's land descended upon us again. A smiling girl covered in blood head to toe, holding a snake around her neck, ran smack into me. I stumbled into Matteo, who readily was there to steady me as I stared bewilderedly at the wild woman who collided with me. This place was so outlandish. I couldn't imagine living as recklessly and free as everyone here lived. Devin looked over his shoulder with a smirk as I stepped away from Matteo's warm body and continued walking with him. Amyas peeked his head between Matteo and I. I wish Cheese Man was here to see this. He lamented, though I wasn't entirely certain exactly what he was referring to. Devin stopped suddenly. Cheese Man. Amyas nodded sadly. He was our musical friend. Matteo snorted lightly. He was a drunk who fell out of a window beside us and became someone's meal. He paused, who also sang a song about cheese. Devin shook his head. I know who he is. He's Benji, and he isn't dead or crazy. Benji is one of Lysander's. Fran quirked a brow, so he's a spy then. He nodded and silently cursed, quickly glancing over his shoulder and scanning the nearby surroundings. Benji is one of his more recognizable lookouts. He's probably alerted Lysander to your presence already. Amyas frowned with a pouted lip, but he seemed so jolly and wise. Devin gave a short laugh and continued walking. Lysander has people all over just like that, unassuming and real. It's how he gets all of his information, which means by the time we get to him, Lysander will already know we are coming thanks to Cheese Man. Amyas quietly started humming the tune Benji had created and fell back in line with Fran behind Matteo and I. You're shaking. FYI, this chapter contains just a lil specie aka mature content, so read at your own discretion. Oh, Matteo was doing his best to act unbothered, but I could see the makings of a smile working their way across his hardened features. Are you done yet? He asked, and after a moment more of stifling my giggles, I nodded and signaled that I was ready to continue. Before Matteo allowed me to start in on him, he walked across to me and corrected my stance, his strong hands gently wrapping around my wrists and adjusting their trajectory before moving to my waist. Mateo's touch sent shivers down my spine as his fingers grazed my midriff, while he was rotating my hips ever so slightly to make my stance stronger. I knew my heart must be pounding even louder and my face even more red than before, so I slipped out of his grasp and batted his all too attentive hands away. "I'm fine. I'm good, let's just get this over with." His eyebrow raised at my sudden change of mood, but he didn't say anything of it. Mateo simply stepped away from me and waited for my first move in silence. I'd been in training all my life. My father had made sure of that. But even after countless years of tutelage, I had yet to master the art of combat. Werewolves were always so much stronger than me. It was a never-ending and rather frustrating cycle of disappointment. I swung my arm towards Mateo's temple, which he easily blocked with his forearm. I lifted my leg and attempted to ram it into his stomach, but he pushed my arm down and barred my leg from making any contact with my very own body. I huffed in annoyance as he pushed me backwards. Mateo shook his head sadly. "Please tell me you were just warming up." He finished with a cocky smirk. I threw out a series of swift blows, all of which he easily dodged while still managing to slowly push me further backwards. Even though I was technically on the offensive against him, Mateo was the one that was driving me back, holding all of the power in the situation. I scrambled to keep distance between us as I racked my mind to strategically plan my next move against him. "You're thinking too much," he explained as he pushed his hand forward and made light contact with my side. I groaned and tried to shove him backwards, but he was unmovable. "So what do you want me to do, just not think at all?" I retorted sarcastically through my teeth. Mateo raised an eyebrow. "You know what I meant." He swung his arm out, and instead of engaging into combat with me, Mateo looped his arms around my waist and pulled me close. I pressed my hands against his chest, but it seemed like whenever we trained, it ended up in very precarious and similar situations. "I thought you wanted to see what training I had. Not this again." I pushed against him, trying to ignore the fact that underneath my hands were those incredibly intoxicating muscles of his. Mateo didn't budge. It was aggravating how easily he held me immobilized. "All right, let's see what you got then." He looked over my shoulder, his eyes mischievously finding something behind me. "Get out of my arms by the time I get to the creek." My head whipped around, and sure enough, Mateo was already walking slowly towards the calm little body of water. I immediately started thrashing around in his grasp, my hands wrapping around his forearms as I tried to pry him off of me. I didn't even realize that I was screaming until Mateo's hand slipped over my mouth and muffled my cries. "FC King Hell, you're going to be fine. It is just your mark." All the warmth was gone. I shoved him off of me, my hand clamping onto my neck to try and alleviate the radiating pain that was screaming from it. I waded my way out of the shallow water and onto the bank. I started storming away from Mateo when I realized that we were still on the opposite side of the river. I dropped my hand from my neck only to twine through my hair as I desperately tried to maintain an even heart rate. If I kept myself calm, the pain would go away much more quick. Even though I knew that every werewolf went through this process, the pain I was experiencing just seemed too brutal to be normal. I returned back to the bank of the river to see Mateo basking carelessly in the sun as if nothing had happened. I tentatively reached my hand up to touch the wound on my neck once more and found a bloody, open mess. That definitely was not right. Normally, when a mate marks another, the wound transforms almost instantly into the gentle scar of the mark. It didn't bleed and fester like I was discovering, and it definitely didn't usually hurt for this long. An intense pain ripped through my body, bringing me to my knees. I screamed out as I collapsed onto my side into the sandy beach, writhing in agony alone. From the other side of the river, I saw Fran and Devin standing on the bank while Amias pushed through the water, rushing over to me. My own mate didn't do that. He skidded to a stop beside me and immediately elevated my head, allowing him better view of the now completely sandy wound. "What did he do to you, Olive?" Mateo narrowed his eyes over at us and swiftly pushed up and off of the sand, stalking over to Amias threateningly. "What did you just say?" He grit out between his teeth. Amias started to shrink away from Mateo, but he was still holding me, and the small movement caused me to groan deeply, which reminded Amias of what was really important in the moment. "Something is obviously wrong with her, Alpha." He lifted me off of the ground and held me tight in his arms even as I contorted in fits of pain. She needs my help. Matteo finally turned his attention to me, his amber eyes scanning over my partially exposed upper half, and then coming to rest on my grotesque mark. Even Matteo couldn't disguise his repulsed reaction upon seeing it. He shook his head as Amia's began wading back into the current with me. I didn't do that. It wasn't that bad when I just marked her. It shouldn't look like that. Amia's suddenly stopped, the water pooling around his knees as he jerked back around. You're right. It shouldn't look like that. His tone was sharp. I'd never heard Amia's sound like that, let alone stand up to Matteo. He took a deep breath, glaring coolly at his alpha before he turned back around and continued through the water. He emerged on the other side with me, making sure the entire time to avoid any jarring movements to cause me unnecessary pain. Amia's gently set me down onto a soft patch of grass as Fran and Devin crowded around me. Fran frowned. What happened to her? Devin shook his head. He looked as if he was going to be sick. I can't be here. That's when I noticed that his eyes were trained on the bloody wound on my neck. He forced himself walk away. I suppose sprint away would be more accurate, though. Amia's didn't answer Fran. He was too engrossed in his own thoughts as he rapidly started to work on me. He tore through his bag and produced a medical kit. He immediately doused the wound in a harsh liquid that burned, but nothing as bad as the roaring flame that was engulfing my entire being. This chapter contains some spicy, mature content, so this is my warning to you ahead of time. Oh, Matteo approached me slowly with a gentle smile as he reached his hand out, silently asking with his eyes for permission. I gladly intertwined our fingers, savoring the illustrious spark that radiated through my being the moment our hands touched. He chuckled, a low rumble that rolled through his chest like a summer thunderstorm. Matteo pulled me close and enveloped me in his arms, holding me securely against his broad chest. He rested his chin atop my head for a moment, while I was content to listen to his steady heartbeat. I looked up at him, and it felt like I was looking up at a skyscraper, strong and lovely. He smiled and placed a kiss on my forehead, and then another on the tip of my freckled nose, and another, until our lips connected. He cupped my face and held me with such tenderness, I nearly melted. I stood up on my tiptoes trying to close the gap between us. I was always wanting more of him. He smiled against my lips, and he wrapped his arms around my waist and lifted me up off of the ground, spinning me once. When Matteo finally placed me down, it was not on the ground. He laid me in the center of a luscious king-sized bed, crawling playfully onto the bed through my knees and back to my lips. Where did the bed come from? I frowned lightly and turned away from him as I tried to figure out where we were, but Matteo was quick to catch my chin lovingly in his hands and redirect my attention back to him. Olive, I love you. He murmured against me, and this time I was smiling. Suddenly the room and how we got there didn't matter to me. Matteo made quick work of undressing me, tossing my clothes messily onto the floor as if the only thing that mattered in the words right in that moment was just the two of us. His hand splayed across my hip bone, rubbing small circles on the exposed skin. I leaned back into the softness of the bed, already writhing beneath him after the simplest of touches. As always, Matteo's keen eyes noticed everything. He smiled knowingly down at me as he slowly lowered his face to the same spot, placing a single, feather-light kiss on my hip bone before his attention was taken elsewhere. With a devilish smile, he grazed his teeth against the waistband of my underwear, taking it between his teeth and dragging it down. I laid there now completely exposed and vulnerable, at the mercy of Matteo, and I couldn't get enough of the feeling. I screamed in ecstasy and my rolls back on their own accord as Matteo's lips connected with my core. He teased me, bringing me to the edge again and again, refusing to give me what I wanted. What I needed. His sensual tormenting was driving me wild. I groaned loudly as I felt his mouth leave me, and when my eyes snapped open, we were no longer in the room. I was standing alone in a river, and the water that pooled around my knees ran red with blood. I scrambled to get away, but the more I struggled with the current, the further it dragged me in. I screamed as the blood-red water pulled me under, the liquid flooding my mouth and lungs as I was forced underwater. I surfaced sputtering. It was hot and sticky, and I realized that this wasn't water at all. My eyes flew open and I sat up immediately. My heart was pounding, and there was a bead of sweat that ran down the side of my face. I looked frantically around and realized that I was not back in the river. I laid back down with a sigh of relief as I understood that it had been a dream. Mateo wasn't moving. It was like I was kissing a statue. After a while longer of embarrassing myself, I stepped away with cheeks burning in shame. FCK. We stood there in silence. The awkward tension was so painful I just wanted to die on the spot. Maybe like spontaneous combustion or something instantaneous like that. All I knew was that I was the stupidest person to ever walk the face of the earth. He reached out and awkwardly pat me on the arm before dropping his hand. I knew that I was going to regret kissing Mateo, but I hadn't expected it to be this soon. I felt sick to my stomach, and I turned away from him because the very sight of him was just one big reminder of my epic failure, and it tormented me to the point of genuine nausea. To my complete surprise, Mateo's hand lightly wrapped around my wrist and prevented me from walking away. Olive, I know what you're thinking, and it's not that at all. What exactly was I thinking anyways? He dragged his other hand through his hair. You're still transitioning. I cut him off with my lips. There I went again, deliberately seeking up my life as if I needed more things to be upset and confused about as it was. Despite the stance Mateo had been laying out seconds before I'd ambushed him with my lips, he eagerly responded to my kiss. His hands automatically moving to my ass where he lifted me up and wrapped my legs around his waist. Maybe I was acting this way because all the disdain I had for him that was pent up inside of me was finally lashing out into the form of unhealthy behaviors and decisions. Honestly, though, with how good Mateo's lips felt crushed against mine in that moment, I didn't give a SHT about what was right and wrong for me to do. One of his hands moved from my butt and up to my neck. Mateo's touch stopping short of the mark on my neck as he tugged on my lower lip, pulling it between his own teeth. He tentatively reached out and placed his hand over the spot on my neck as a comforting gesture. But the moment his hand met my mark, a resounding crack boomed across the forest. It was only when intense pain tore through my body seconds later that I realized the cracking noise had come from me. My back was arched and contorted as my spine continued to crack and break, bones loudly combusting within me that sent me falling to the ground, screaming. Mateo prevented my fall, catching my body and cradling it in his arms as every bone in my body soon began to follow in suit. You're shifting, Olive. His lips were pressed against my ear through my hair as he ministered over my strangled screaming. Mateo tried his best to keep my body calm, but when your entire body is forcefully reorganizing itself, it proves to be quite the task. Amias burst through the trees, sprinting over and grabbing Mateo's shoulder. Alpha, you need to let her go. Mateo looked from Amia's back at my twisting frame and hesitantly released me just as my ribs began shifting within me, throwing me to my side away from their view. But just as suddenly as the shift had begun, my body began to reverse the process and return back to normal just as quickly. I writhed on the grass for a few more lingering moments before I was stilled, and was left just laying there thoroughly exhausted and confused and very much still human. Mateo rushed back over to me and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into his body and delivering me over to Amia's. I can walk. I'm fine. My voice came out as a coarse croak. It sounded even more exhausted than I felt in the moment. I glanced over at Mateo, and the moment he returned my gaze, I dropped mine like a skittish child. From the corner of my eyes, I saw Mateo roll his eyes as he reached over and collected my hand into his. Immediately, my eyes fell to our interlocked hands. What were we doing? I internally sighed, but it was after seeing Mateo's suddenly concerned expression I realized that it hadn't been so internal after all. Is getting to know each other really that terrible? He teased me with a good-natured smile. Why, yes, it actually was terrible, but now I was in the same boat as Mateo. My wolf depended on me salvaging this relationship, and that was everything to me. I wanted to be a werewolf more than anything else in the entire world, so I could more than handle this. There was another part of me, perhaps the logical side that reminded me I hadn't found Mateo all that terrible when we were madly making out with each other. I was always making excuses for my behavior, explaining away why I was slowly letting my walls down around him. I hated that part of me mostly because I knew it was right. I was a hypocritical and indecisive little BTCH. Was it so bad that I found myself intrigued by Mateo, my mate, my captor and adversary? I offered him up the best smile I could forge in that moment. It's just a lot to process. It seemed like I'd been giving that answer a lot lately. By Devon's account, we've got a couple more days' worth of traveling, which means we have the liberty to take this slow. You've got all the time you need to process. Mateo assured me and gave me an affirming hand squeeze. He could tell I wasn't convinced. My favorite color is brown. Mateo informed me as we lazily walked through the woods, taking our time to return back to the rest of the group. That's awful. I let out a soft giggle. It is not, he defended quickly, not like SHT Brown, but more like. Mateo trailed off in thought as he searched for the best way to explain it, his eyes resting on my brown hair, and I felt my face heat up. Nervously, I tucked my hair behind my ears, mine's yellow. He quirked an eyebrow at me, and you thought mine was bad. I elbowed him in the side and kept walking, tugging him along behind me as I moved on. All right, I have a question for you. Mateo asked from behind me, what's the story behind your name? Because Olive is quite the name. I playfully scowled over at him, and he quickly raised his hands in innocence, in the best way possible, of course. Nice save. I cleared my throat. There was no profound explanation behind my goofy-ass name, but I didn't want to share the real story behind it, because that would mean talking to Mateo about my deceased mother, and I could barely do that on my own. My dad just really loved olive martinis, so he decided to name me after his favorite alcoholic vegetable beverage. To my relief, instead of pressing me over the details, Mateo just chuckled, easing my nerves. I don't think olives are a vegetable, Olive. I was skeptical, but honestly, who the hell really cared what was an olive anyways? He accepted my version of events, and that's all that mattered. My turn. I wasn't really interested in delving into the intricacies of my family, or rather lack of family. I was keen to change the subject and shift the attention away from me as quickly as possible. I could ask him a similarly meaningless question. I mean, how could my favorite color and the backstory to my name be beneficial for the both of us anyways? Instead, I decided to pick from the thousands of unanswered, pent-up questions locked in my head from the course of our time together. There is mature content in this chapter, so read only if you can handle that sort of dealio. And if you are a cool cat, before me. Mateo had another mate. It was a concept that I was struggling to get my reeling head around, but Mateo had been right. This line of questioning had led to me getting upset. And what was even more irritating than my initial hurt upon hearing this new information was that I knew exactly what this pain implied. It meant that I had feelings for Mateo. You didn't kill her, right? I blurted out, immediately slapping a hand over my mouth. Mateo surprisingly wasn't upset, or visibly at least. He almost seemed caught off guard that was the particular question I settled upon. I did not. He affirmed with a cautious nod of his head, apparently satisfied with my lack of outburst. He rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. Mal actually rejected me. My eyes widened as the pieces started to come together. Shortly after Isabel turned me, I joined into Ardor as one of their own. It was there where I met Mal and discovered that she was my mate. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, but I noticed it. Everything was as ideal as any normal wolf could hope for, until Mal got it into her head that there were people coming after her. She began to obsess over her, this outlandish idea that someone was hunting her down and wouldn't stop until she was dead. Mal drove herself into insanity. Then one night, she was tearing me out of bed and rejecting me supposedly for my own safety. I leaned forward ever so slightly, listening a little too intently to Mateo's explanation than I was entirely comfortable with. I straightened immediately. Well, was someone really after her? He snorted and looked over at me as if I was as crazy as Mal. Obviously not. Mateo sighed and dropped his hand from the back of his neck. She was troubled, and I was unable to see that earlier, because I was blinded by the bond. Being rejected by Mal was the greatest pain I'd ever experienced. The very act of breathing alone became a chore. Mateo absent-mindedly picked at the bark of a tree beside us before beginning to walk again, forcing me to follow after him if I wanted to hear the rest of what he had to say. Needless to say, I walked, I had to get out of Ardor. It was too painful for me there, so I left. He explained. I scrounged around on my own for a while as a pseudo-rogue until I stumbled upon Malice Pack, but that is besides the fact. Mateo looked over at me as we walked when I found you. Imagine my surprise. He shook his head, not particularly liking the way he started. All of these feelings and emotions I'd kept pent up inside of me as a result of Mal's rejection projected themselves onto you. Yet still, I couldn't bring myself to inflict that same kind of pain onto anyone else. He cracked the smallest of smiles, the dark alpha of malice, afraid of hurting someone's feelings, a first for everything, I suppose. I was slightly ashamed by my first assumption that Mateo had been the one to harm his mate, when in reality it was quite reversed. I looked down at his hands and noticed they were clenched tightly. I boldly reached over and took his hand in mine, surprising the both of us. I'm glad you didn't reject me. His eyes widened slightly, and it sent me anxiously scrambling to recover from that embarrassing omission, for our wolves' sake, of course. I coughed nervously, trying and failing to maintain an air of casualty. Is this entire trip one giant game of who can make Amias most uncomfortable? Amias exclaimed and covered his face with his hand as I scrambled to zip up my fly and button the top button on my pants. Because if so, you all are winning. He turned away from Mateo and I, and just as he was faced with Fran and Devin walking through the brush as if nothing had transpired between them, completely unaware that Amias had told us of what happened. What's going on, everybody? Fran announced with a smile. They know. Amias bluntly stated, and Fran's smile fell immediately, turning into a much more sheepish version. Devin rolled his eyes, clearly not one for Amias' theatrics. He walked past Amias with Fran in tow and came to a stop in front of Mateo and handed him a crumpled piece of paper that he'd fished from the depths of his pocket. If that's a love letter, I swear. Amias warned. Mateo growled lowly in irritation. He pulled out a cell phone from his pocket and tossed it to Amias. Go call Felix and don't come back until your mate has talked some sense into you. Amia's eyes immediately lit up, an entirely new person in milliseconds. He caught the phone and held it to his chest for a gleeful moment before he rushed off dialing Felix. I felt for him. He was away from his loved ones, and on top of that essentially fifth-wheeling even though none of us were officially anything at all. I'd be annoyingly bitter too if it were me, but then again, I'm always bitter so I don't really count. Mateo unfolded the paper. It looked like it was a flyer for some kind of ritzy gala event. They're hung up everywhere. Lysander is advertising some kind of celebration. Devin explained and shrugged once. It has the potential to be just the right cover we need. Mateo mulled the idea over for a moment, his hand absent-mindedly rubbing his stubbled chin as he weighed his options internally. Finally, he nodded. It beats what I had originally planned. His comment surprised me. I raised a brow over at him and he immediately looked away. If he hadn't already caught my interest, I was definitely invested now. What did you originally have planned? Devin let out a breath, trying to suppress a laugh to the point where he had to turn away. Fran scowled at him, trying to get him to stop laughing. What was it? I demanded again, not particularly enjoying Devin's reaction to my persistence. Mateo shot a glare at which Devin, the terrifying and bloodthirsty vampire, immediately stopped snickering. This was before everything, and it wasn't really a plan, per se. I waited expectantly for him to continue. He huffed in irritation when he realized that I wasn't letting him off the hook. I was going to use you as bait. I stood there expressionless, mostly upset with myself for allowing myself to feel surprised. This shouldn't be a shock that Mateo would have planned something like this, to use me like that. He reached forward to take my hand, but I quickly pulled away, stepping back to keep distance. It's not as bad as it sounds, Olive, and we're obviously not going to do that anymore. Mateo explained and again tried to close the gap between us, but I refused. A cold laugh escaped my lips. You really had me for a second. I folded my arms across my chest. I actually believed that you were changing, that you cared about me. I groggily began to come to. The first realization I had was that I was not waking up where I should have been. Instead of greeting the morning from the grassy forest floor with our little group, I found myself lying on the cool concrete floor of a room all by myself. As I continued to wake up, I realized that I was not in fact alone. There was someone else in the room talking in fact. I wasn't sure what or who it was, and I was dreading the moment I had to open my eyes to investigate and face the reality of the events that had transpired yesterday. Darkness falls across the land. The midnight hour is close at hand. Creatures crawl in search of blood to terrorize your neighborhood. And whosoever shall be found, without the soul for getting down, must stand and face the hounds of hell. What the hell is happening? The foulest stench is in the air. The funk of 40,000 years and grisly hold from every tomb are closing in to seal your doom. Yep, I was going to die for sure. And though you fight to stay alive, your body starts to shiver. Wait a second, this can't be. For no mere mortal can resist the evil of the thriller. My eyes flew open as suddenly, blaring forth, the opening trumpets to Michael Jackson's famous tune flooded the room as the song started over. I knew that ominous monologue seemed familiar. I let out a sigh of relief knowing now that I wasn't in someone else's company, and as I sat up from the cold ground, I finally opened my eyes. A pair of eyes were boring into mine. Just a few feet away, Ansel sat cross-legged in front of me. He smiled and I screamed, so I wasn't alone after all. "Morning, sunshine," he greeted. I scooted away from him as quickly and as far as I could until my back slammed against a wall and he laughed. Thriller is just one of those songs you can never get tired of listening to, you know? I didn't know. Well, I did, but when you were abducted by a strange man who offered you candy before drugging you, appreciating a song wasn't a priority for me. Who was I kidding, though? The song really was a timeless masterpiece. Stay away from me, Ansel. My friends are going to be angry. They'll know I'm missing instantly, and once they put things together, they will come for you. I tried my best to sound confident and intimidating as I threatened him, but it was difficult because I myself was not entirely convinced there would be a rush to go looking for me, or a desire to check on me at all, considering how my last words to Mateo had been to keep far away from me. Ansel grinned and nodded enthusiastically. I'm counting on that. Why do bad things happen to me? I mean, I feel like I am a fairly decent, moderately okay citizen, and yet the worst things tend to gravitate towards me all of the time. I must have been truly awful in a past life to have earned the one that I have now. I cleared my throat and tried to compose myself. If it's money that you want, it's not. Ansel cut me off. Okay, I frowned. I didn't know if this was now a good thing or a very, very bad one. What exactly do you want from me then? He raised an eyebrow over at me, clearly skeptical to believe my confusion. Come on now, quit playing. His brow quickly contorted when he realized that I truly had no idea what was going on. Wait, you really don't know? Recap, the door in the far corner blowing off of its hinges. It flew across the space and collided squarely with Ansel's chest, sending them both sliding backwards, trapped underneath the massive piece of metal. I screamed and immediately rushed to go and help Ansel, but a loud growl froze me to my spot. There in the shattered doorway stood a rather angry-looking brown wolf with all too recognizable amber eyes. Mateo had come for me despite our last exchange. He was a little too late, though, because as it turned out, I didn't need his saving after all. What the hell is your problem? I shouted over at Mateo as he was in the middle of shifting back into his human form while I took the opportunity to walk to Ansel. He was unconscious, and I honestly didn't know if that was a good or bad thing in the moment. Most likely bad. I crouched down beside him and attempted to lift the metal door from his lifeless body when Mateo grabbed me by my forearm from behind and tugged me away from Ansel. What the hell is my problem? He hissed venomously. I spent all this time trying to track you down and save you from that maniac who kidnapped you, and this is the thanks I get. My eyes narrowed automatically. This was the Mateo I was most familiar with. For the record, people who do good things for the benefit of others and not for themselves don't need validation for their good deeds. I retorted and tried to remove my arm from his grasp, but he only tightened his grip, and Ansel is not a maniac. He needs help. Mateo laughed coldly, right? Like that's going to happen. We are leaving, Olive. My lower lip trembled as I stared up at Mateo. I searched his face for any shred of the other version of him, the nicer one who actually gave a SHT about me. He met my gaze in full force, and in that moment, I felt every ounce of his alpha title. Mateo was making a silent display of his authority, daring me to say otherwise. I was the first to break the stare, my eyes dropping to the floor. If there is even the smallest part of you that genuinely cares about me, please let me help him. For a split second, I felt Mateo's grip on my arm lighten, and I knew I had him. The next time I tried to pull away, my arm broke free. Immediately, I rushed back to Ansel's side and began to try and lift the heavy piece from him. The muscles in my arms felt like they were going to tear apart from the effort I was exerting, and yet the door would not budge. I wasn't strong enough. I groaned nervously as I looked back down at Ansel and saw that he was slowly beginning to stir and come to, which only pushed me harder to keep at my efforts. I shoved my shoulder into the side of the metal, and suddenly the door miraculously lifted with exceptional ease. My small smile of accomplishment faltered as I looked to my side and saw Mateo standing above me, lifting the entire metal door with a single hand like it was made of paper. He tossed the hulking piece of metal aside, and as if on cue Ansel coughed awake, Mateo reached around me and grabbed Ansel by the neck of his shirt, effectively lifting him from the ground to his own eye level. "Stop, let him go." I pushed off of the ground and protested against his treatment. Ansel wants to help us. He wants to get rid of Lysander too. He didn't hurt me. Ansel doesn't mean any harm. Ansel began blinking slowly, clearly struggling to regain complete consciousness and wrap his head around the sudden change of events at the same time. He immediately began thrashing around in Mateo's grasp, but his efforts were useless. Mateo was far stronger than Ansel, a concept I was all too familiar with myself. I always listen to music while I'm writing. This Lil tune by Hosier has really influenced Olive and Mateo's dynamic, so I figured I would shout it out. Enjoy. Oh, ooh, 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 ooh. There are moments in life that while it is happening, you just know that you are going to remember it. Sometimes that means it's a bad memory being created. Other times is overwhelmingly good. As Mateo blankly stared back at me after my admission of true feelings for him, I waited to learn what kind of moment I was going to be dealing with. I didn't have to wait long because Mateo's blank, almost paralyzed face quickly contorted into pure joy. He wrapped his arms around my waist, and I automatically closed my eyes expecting a kiss, but he pulled my body against his and buried his face into my hair instead. Mateo held me so tightly, it was almost painful. Somehow this was better, though. The physicality and realness of this simple gesture managed to mean so much more than any kiss we'd ever shared, or ever would share, I imagined. But like all good things in my life, it was too sweet to last. Slowly at first and then with increasing speed, a single person began clapping from behind Mateo and I. Instantly, we split apart just as Devin burst out of the room with a worried expression across his face, as if he was about to preemptively warn us, but it was too late. "Ah, young love," a voice taunted. Mateo placed his arm protectively in front of me as he turned almost in slow motion to face the new arrival. Arrivals would be more appropriate, however. We were surrounded. That was the first thing I noticed. The next was even more unsettling, if that was possible. When I looked back over to the bunker, I found Ansel slipping between Devin's body and the frame of the door. His head hung low, and he refused to make eye contact with me or anyone, really. Ansel made what felt like the longest journey of the space between bunker to the strangers standing opposite of us, and it was only after he took his place beside one of the men out front when he dared look up. I met his saddened gaze with burning eyes. I'd saved him, and he betrayed me. Ansel had lied to me the entire time. He had no intentions of helping us. It was all a farce to buy him some time until his backup arrived. I should have let Mateo have his way with him. So sweet and pure. The man beside Ansel grabbed a hold of his face, kind of like little Ansel here, such a good kid. He roughly pushed his face away and messed with Ansel's hair before stepping away from him like he was a discarded toy. He laughed, his hand falling onto his hip where there was a shiny gun sitting in a holster. No doubt fully loaded with silver bullets. "Awa," he cooed in a syrupy, sweet voice, dripping with disdain and malcontent. "Don't be upset with him. He was only doing his job when he reported you guys." The man tugged the weapon from his holster, waving it around lazily as he spoke. "Same rules apply to me as well. I'm only doing my job, you see. It is just business. I'm so sorry I had no choice. Please, you have to understand they have my sister. Ansel rushed out, words tumbling at a mile a minute as shoving past the armed man as he desperately tried to explain himself and convey his sincerity. Don't go with Samson. The gala is a sharp crack pierced the sky, and suddenly a red spot began to form on the left side of Ansel's chest. Mateo's hand was quickly covering my mouth, and it was only then when I realized a scream was tearing its way through my throat as I watched the crimson bloomed rapidly across his shirt. Ansel looked down at his shirt in a dissociated state of disbelief. His eyes were glassed over as he lifted his hand to press it against the dark substance, staining his shirt, and lift it before his face. Ansel stared from his bloody hand back up to me. He smiled and then collapsed into a heap onto the floor. Mateo wrapped his arms around me, pinning my arms to my side and effectively limiting my thrashing and any impulsive actions I might have been considering. Instead of blowing the smoke away from the barrel of his gun, Samson inhaled deeply, pulling every last wisp of murder from the weapon and absorbing it into his system. He glanced down at Ansel's crumpled and bloodied body. He let out a short laugh as he replaced his weapon and purposely stepped over Ansel. Just barely missing him. I take it back now, that was not business. The kid was just a little too goody two-shoes, if you know what I mean. He had it coming. He smiled wickedly, and yet through it all, Mateo remained unfazed. You've made your point, let's skip the dramatics. Mateo dryly responded as if this was one of the most boring conversations he'd ever had. As if Ansel wasn't lying in a pool of his own blood just feet away from us. He narrowed his eyes. Your boyfriend thinks he's some kind of comic. I'd advise you to keep your BTCH on a tighter leash, girl. I spoke too soon. This time it was my turn to hold Mateo back as he pushed forward, and I struggled to keep him from lunging across at the man. He grinned directly at me. He knew exactly what he was doing and the position that it put me in. Samson was savoring every moment of this encounter. I didn't care about Samson. All I could think of was Ansel's final act. He must have known the consequences, and yet he still was determined to right the wrongs he'd made by speaking out. He sacrificed himself. I whispered to no one in particular, maybe even just to myself. I wasn't really aware or sure. Mateo suddenly stared down at me in disbelief. Are you crazy? He whispered harshly to me just as Samson cleared his throat. Am I interrupting something? He used the classic sarcastic high school teacher line, and normally I would have found humor in it, but I couldn't take my eyes off of Ansel's body, so laughing was the last thing on my mind. I peeked behind me, using Mateo's height to my advantage as he covered my body for the most part. Fran, Amias, and Devin stood in the doorway now together, looking as worried as I did. Samson rolled his eyes. Look, it doesn't matter to me. The boss said he wanted you dead or alive, so how the rest of this goes is all on you. I advise you all to tread carefully. Oh, ooh, 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 don't hate me, PLSSSS. We are 101 in the charts, oh, that's the highest we've ever been. 101, I am shooketh. Next update, 2K votes 333. That is such a big number, holy shit, XXQ, the events that transpired next happened in a frightening blur. Mateo recognized the predicament we found ourselves in, and as an attempt to keep us all alive, he surrendered willingly. I realized how great of an alpha he was in that moment because I could tell that every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stand up and fight. But he didn't. He wasn't alone anymore. There were more lives at stake than just his own, and he accepted this. Mateo allowed himself be cuffed, and then in quick succession the rest of us were restrained in a similar fashion. The second that the cuffs touched everyone else's skin, their faces were warped in pain. They must be silver cuffs, but strangely enough, the metal was having no effect on me. Sure, they were uncomfortable like any pair of cuffs would be, I assumed, but nowhere near the burning pain that the rest of our group seemed to be experiencing. Devin was outfitted with a bizarre spiked wooden collar of sorts around his neck. I had never seen anything like it. The spikes faced inward and pressed against his pale skin. I knew stakes were lethal to his kind, but I didn't know wood in general was a deterrent. After we were all handcuffed individually, to Samson's smug satisfaction, he linked us horizontally together with a single chain so we were all strung along together. Even more silver with still no effect on me. At this point, I was starting to become a little concerned, and unfortunately, I wasn't the best at hiding my emotions. Right as Samson gave the command for us to get moving, one of his men seemed to notice my lack of response to the silver as well. "Oi," he called out, suddenly standing in front of me, effectively preventing me from walking. "The silver's not working on this one, Sam." Samson froze mid-step, slowly pivoting around to face us. "What do you mean the silver isn't working?" He grit out through clenched teeth and then stalked over to me. He yanked the loose chain up to his face before quickly dropping it as the toxic metal seared into his skin. "It's definitely working all right," which brought him to the only other logical conclusion. If it wasn't the silver that was dysfunctional, I must be the problem here. Samson narrowed his eyes and leaned in close to me, inhaling deeply through his nostrils. "She certainly smells funny," he commented suspiciously before his eyes landed on my mark on my neck. "Definitely a were, though. Get a load of that mark." He shoved the hair from my neck and pushed my face to the side so his men could get a better look at my festering mark. I heard Mateo growl a few feet away from me, clearly regretting surrendering in this moment. "It looks like it's rotting. I'm gonna puke." I've never seen a mark look like that before. A few of the more memorable comments from the chaotic chorus of disgust that rang out after Samson brought it to everyone's attention. I knew my mark was bad, but I didn't know it looked that awful. When Samson finally removed his hand from my face, I immediately looked over to Mateo, searching his face for some kind of rational explanation. He shook his head and held and lifted his cuffed hands to his face, holding a single finger to his lips. "Olive, my mother died when she was giving birth to me. It's what I've been told for as long as I can remember by my dad." It's a little-known fact about me, as the whole disappeared dad thing usually takes precedence. The early passing of my mother is also how I got my namesake. Her name was Olivia, and as a way to honor his late wife, my father wanted to continue her namesake through me. The gesture would have been totally heartwarming if it weren't for the fact that my dad was quirky as hell. He had the bright idea that instead of just naming me Olivia, like any sane person would do, it would be a good decision to put a fun little spin on his dead wife's name. And thus the name Olive came into being. My dad was absolutely mad for thinking my name was anything remotely cute. All it's done is provide my countless bullies endless jokes at my expense. To my father, though, it put a smile on his face every day. So I put up with the taunting and teasing and didn't bother going about changing it. Besides, the paperwork to legally change your name was way too much work anyways. Even after my father disappeared, I endured through it all and wore both my names proudly like a badge. Olive, Ludovic. Families are messy. They are complicated, loud, and imperfect. They are something I've longed to have back in my life ever since I was left all alone. The Ludovic family of 3, it was an idea that enticed and haunted me simultaneously for as long as I could remember. I craved the bickering. I yearned for the feeling of anguish after being scolded by a parent. I would have given anything to have a complete family again. But with a 100 dead mother and a 99.9 sure dead father, that dream of having 2 parents who were actually alive and could complete my family was unrealistic at best. Amyas suddenly snorted and tore me from me self-deprecating, orphan thoughts. Despite the situation we all found ourselves in, he burst into a quiet fit of stifled laughter. He covered his mouth with his hand, and I quickly gathered what he was giggling about. I mean, Lysander's voice was exceptionally high-pitched for a guy. Even I could admit it was slightly funny even with the ominous situation we found ourselves in. It was a high enough octave to give pause. The voice was way too high-pitched to come from a man, which could only mean one thing. Samson shoved Fran forward, which drug us all with her. The closer we got to the famed vampire king, the more realized that Lysander was not really a Lysander. The overly dramatic lighting combined with the distance shrouded the figure from sight at first glance, but now as I stood in the light with the figure, it was quite obvious that Lysander was not a he after all. Lysander was a woman. She had cropped brown hair paired with floor-length black dress robes and garnet eyes. The woman was slender and tall. Her face was immaculately smooth and without a single flaw. She was somehow stunning and terrifying at the same time, mostly terrifying, though. As if the shock of Lysander's gender was not a big enough surprise, it appeared that was not the biggest shock of the day after all. My mother was dead. I've known this since my oldest of my memories. That was the reason there were no pictures of her around the house as I grew up. It was too painful for my father, so I never got to see her or what she looked like, but I understood that. Death was an awful thing to experience all on its own, let alone the death of someone you loved, so I never questioned it. So as if hearing an evil, vampire stranger tell you that they were your dead mother wasn't terrifying enough, it was the fact that there was no real way for me to repudiate her claim that frightened me even more. Lysander smiled down at me, scalding every moment of my shock. Surprised, didn't even come close. She reached out towards my face, her pale skin moving seamlessly through the air. I flinched, and instantly Lysander retracted her hand. I'm sure you have a great deal of questions for me. I myself have to admit to being equally surprised about all of this as well. Imagine my shock when one of the illegal intruders turns out to be my own flesh and blood. Lysander coolly smiled at me, and it made my blood run dry. Suddenly, a door to our side magically opened itself. Lysander stepped aside and welcomed me into the room, beckoning me in first. I was wary, to say the least. We'd already traversed quite a distance from the audience hall, and the farther we moved from there, it meant farther I was from Matteo. I paused in the frame of the large oak door. The room was empty and poorly lit like most of the lair, the only exception being a lone orb sitting atop a narrow pedestal. In the gloomy dark, the crystal ball had a hazy green glow to it that lit up the room. All the answers you seek are just a few steps in front of you, dear one. Lysander purred, and I hardly noticed because I was so mesmerized by the glowing crystal. I felt it pulling me, like a million hands suddenly were reaching out and gently tugging at every wisp of my being to step inside of the room. Won't you come inside? I jumped and looked up at Lysander to see if she had just whispered to me, but she was no longer standing beside me. She now stood alongside the orb at the center of the room. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes as I stepped inside of the room, and instantly the door closed itself behind me. I didn't even bother glancing behind me. My gaze was focused on the emanating green light before me. Lysander smiled warmly and opened her arms for me to join her, but I didn't need the invitation. My feet were already moving on their own accord until I was eye level with the orb. Up close, it was even more mesmerizing if that was possible. It was a clear crystal sphere, but it was surrounded by a green, almost fog-like haze. Lysander reached around me, enveloping me in her black robes, and placed a spindly hand on the crystal. Go on, don't be afraid, my child. Everything will be explained to you if you let the orb in. Everything will be explained to me if I just let the orb in. Answers, an explanation, and an end to my constant state of confusion. It's what I've dreamed of for the entirety of my life. Hi, peeps, remember me. It's been a long time and I've got lots to explain, so stick around for the author's note at the bottom, please. Okay, thank you, and back to your regularly scheduled program. There were many moments in the past weeks that I assumed would be my last, with the good majority of those times being at the hands of Matteo, ironically enough. Maybe when my pack was attacked, or the time I was kidnapped, maybe even the time when I was marked. But this fear had a much more final feeling to it, a heavy permanence around it that settled onto my chest and was choking me softly. I stared into Matteo's face, peering at every line and feature in search of some kind of a reaction. I wanted an indicator for how I should be responding to all of this, because frankly, I was in over my head. Labored breathing and thundering footsteps could be heard from down the hall, and suddenly, Samson skidded into the room through the door Matteo had unhinged. Samson stared from our embrace to Lysander wordlessly, and with a flick of her wrist, he engaged and approached us. Take them both. She's of no use to me now, Lysander instructed over her shoulder, not bothering to turn and face me, her only child. No use. Matteo was up in an instant, and even in my dazed shock, I noticed the muscles in his arms rippling as he barred Samson from stepping any closer. His eyes were rapidly darkening, as were Samson's, and I knew that I couldn't let Matteo do anything stupid on my behalf since I was a lost cause for saving. There's no sense in having Matteo get the SHT beaten out of him. I immediately shoved off the floor and forced my body into action. I faced Lysander and pleaded with my mother, "We'll go to wherever you want to take us. Please just don't hurt Matteo." Both men suddenly turned, their attention piqued and temporarily distracting them from the standoff they'd been locked in. "This isn't negotiable. We aren't going anywhere with her, and neither are our friends." Matteo interjected with a pointed look in my direction, but I was so focused on Lysander. My eyes bore into her back, waiting for her to turn around and look me in the eye as this was happening. Matteo grasped my wrist gently and tried to bring me back to him, but I was resolute. "Olive." He warned lowly, and this time pulled me with more force backwards into him just as Lysander turned around. "Please, I'll do whatever you want whenever you want it for the time I have left. I just want your word that he will be safe." I pressed once more. Matteo scoffed as if I was mad. "The time that you have left. Safe? Olive, what is going on?" And with that, Lysander finally turned around, her ruby eyes weighing down on me like 1,000 bricks before she tore her deadly stare away and onto her next target. She pointed a pale, wispy finger at Matteo's chest and crept closer to him with a deadly cadence. "Olive is my only child, my sweet, sweet daughter. Which means that she is also part vampire as a result of her lineage, and due to your lack of intelligence, you've ruined everything, don't you see? This fate is your own. You've done this to yourself." Suddenly, I felt Matteo's firm hold on me falter, and he took a tentative step back from me. His amber eyes moved back and forth rapidly across my features, scanning me for some sort of verification for Lysander's statement, and I couldn't bear to give it to him. "Is it true?" His voice didn't sound frightened or saddened, it was devoid of emotion, and with every passing second his features were morphing into that same steely exterior from so long ago when I first met him. Lysander let out a sound of irritation as a heavy silence fell between Matteo and I when I didn't answer him right away. "You've murdered your mate. Congratulations." The harshness of her words stunned me to the core. Her words stung like an icy blade, and I could tell that I was not the only one that felt brutalized by it. Matteo looked as if he truly had killed someone. The expression on his furrowed brow looked so pained so suddenly. This time, it was me that was reaching out to grip his arm, but Matteo flinched and jerked his arm away from me as if my very touch disgusted him. I felt my lip begin to tremble. He refused to look at me as he turned to Samson and offered him his wrists, which were quickly clasped in silver. Matteo didn't even flinch. The pain had already been etched into his features so much so that there wasn't any need for an additional reaction. "You are right. She is of no use to you and I am to blame. Do whatever you want with me, but let Olive go free for whatever time she has left." He sounded so distant, and I couldn't help the tears that spilled over. Why was he doing this to me? Why was he so upset with me when I couldn't do anything to stop this? Lysander clicked her tongue and shook her head, and in an instant, Samson was repeating the process with my same wrists. "You're not the alpha dog here. That's not how things work. Take them to the cells with the others." "Others?" Samson shoved me forward past Matteo and through the door, yanking him along behind us. We were out in the hallway and out of sight from the room when a loud crack like something had broken, ripped through the silent walkway from behind us. I turned around as he marched, and I saw the broken crystal orb lying in pieces behind me, and I couldn't keep the ominous feeling away. It was a very apt depiction of how my life was going right in this very moment. While I was turned around, my eyes lingered on Matteo. I waited for him to look up and acknowledge me, but he didn't. He wouldn't look back at me, and before I knew it, Samson was tanking my head back around the right direction down the hall, and I lost my chance to see if he ever would look up. Oh, it's been 2 months since the last update sadness. Honestly, I really struggled writing this chapter, and if it was because of the long wait, or because of the waning interest in this book, it was just hard, and I needed to put that out there for the interwebs to see lol. One more thing I need to vent about this is not your average werewolf book. My characters aren't perfect, and neither are their love lives, so not to sound blunt, but get over it. If you want to read a cliché book where everything goes perfect and exactly how it is supposed to happen, then have fun doing that somewhere else, because this is not that book. It will never be this book. With that said, thank you to the people who love the quirkiness of this book and all of the twists and turns. Thank you for appreciating its uniqueness. I appreciate all of you. People aren't perfect. Life isn't always sunshine and rainbows, And that's what makes this book special 3OK with that said next update 5.1K votes. It's a lot of votes just like last time, but I refuse to backpedal on all the progress we've made on this book. If you tag 3 people who you think would like Olive's story on this chapter, I will give you a shout out on the next chapter. Trying to think of fun ways to get this story popping again. Alrighty. Sorry for this essay author's note, and I hope your week is lovely. Oh, and also, thank you for hanging in there. XXQ, you know that whole speech about waiting for the votes to be reached. And blah, 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 yeah, well, I remembered you all waited like almost 3 months for the last chapter. Sue surprise do ooh. We were guided back down the hallway from where we came, and were lead deep down into the bowels of the complex. It was significantly colder and darker, where Samson was taking us than the top floors. After what felt like an excruciating hour of silent marching, he stopped in front of a door and used his shoulder to push against the frame to budge it open. A cold breeze rushed out of the pitch-black room to greet us, while Samson made quick work of freeing Mateo and I from our restraints, allowing the cuffs to loudly fall at our feet on the cold floor. I didn't even have time for my eyes to adjust in the slightest before we were shoved inside and the door locked behind us. I couldn't see anything for an eerily long time. I didn't know where Mateo was in all of this, and the fact that he didn't seem to be talking to me wasn't helping either. Finally, though, the darkness began to seem not so dark, and I could start to see the room that we were locked inside of. While it technically was a cell since we were locked inside, the interior was anything but that. The room looked old, but it was entirely furnished. It was just bathed in darkness. My eyes journeyed throughout the room and came across Mateo, who had moved literally as far away from me in the small space as humanly possible. It made me clench my fists at my sides in a feeble attempt to contain my immediate waves of rage. I was the one dying here, not him. It just didn't make any sense, and it was the confusion of it all that was infuriating me the most. What the fuck is the matter with you? I railed on Mateo the very next instant. His downcast face suddenly peaked with interest and jerked upwards. His amber eyes practically flowed in the shadows of the room as he made his way across the room. I regretted my word choice for a split second before I remembered that I was dying, so I shouldn't have to filter myself in the short time I have left. With every step Mateo took closer to me, I skirted away, but the room was only so big, and soon my back was pressed against the wall and Mateo's body entirely too close for comfort. Whatever this has been, Olive, it's over. The sooner you get that through your thick head, the better. His voice was thick and low, yet it still managed to sound like nails on a chalkboard to innocent, unaware ears, and he wasn't even finished. Mateo wound his hands through his hair, closing his eyes for a split second before dropping his hands and opening his eyes suddenly. I should have rejected you a long time ago. All my life, I thought if I ever had the misfortune of even hearing the word reject in this context, I would be a weepy mess, but right now it just totally pissed me off. Oh, you should have. Really? I mocked up to Mateo, emphasizing the last word with a hard poke of my finger against his chest. Care to elaborate on that, because last I checked, everything was going just swimmingly between the two of us. I had thought things were going well for brief, flickering moments, but my voice came off cold and sarcastic. Oops. Mateo growled and bat my hands away from his chest. Don't you get it? He shook his head. It's like I'm finally seeing everything for the first time in the light. All of everything that has ever happened to you in the span of these last few weeks is a direct result of me and my pride. His fist suddenly collided with the wall beside us. She was right. I was selfish, and because of me you are dying. Again his hand slammed into the wall, the dry wall cracking and falling to the ground to reveal a concrete shell. There was blood against the cool surface. I didn't need to take over your pack that day. I had known of the wrongs that had been taking place there for years, but I wanted more. More power, more packs, more blood. I didn't have to bring you with me. I had no use for a mate, but I was selfish, and the thought of leaving you there, even though I hated your existence, nauseated me. I didn't have to turn you, but I wanted you a certain way, and I took that choice away from you. Everything, it is all because of me, and now you're dying, and there is nothing I can do about it, Olive. I love you, and I can't save you. I'm no good for you. You and I both know this. I reached up and slapped him the moment the words left his lips. I moved so quick that it even caught me a little off guard. I halfway didn't expect to make contact with his face, but I definitely did by the throbbing in my palm and the intense anger radiating from Mateo's eyes. I pulled my hand away from his face just as fast, but this time Mateo was ready for the motion and caught my wrist before I could move it away. "How dare you?" I bit out with as much venom as I could muster as I tried to tug my arm free from his arm, but Mateo held fast. "You can't just go and tell someone you love them as they are dying. Do you know how seriously fooked that is?" Mateo's hand tightened ever so slightly as he enveloped the entirety of my wrist in his palm before he dropped it altogether and walked away from me. I blinked in disbelief. I don't know what I had expected, but this was certainly not it, and maybe it was the adrenaline in my system, or maybe the mortality crisis I was currently dealing with, but I couldn't stop myself. Want to know what is even more fooked than that? My voice rang across the dark room, and even in the shadows, I could see Mateo's body stiffen. That even after everything we have been through, I love you too, Mateo. Oh, ooh, 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 okay, so oops, there's an early update, hopefully. That is a good start to making it up to you loyal peeps after going me on you for so long. Let me know what you thought. Vote count it back on though for reals now. 5K votes next update. Thanks a bunch for being the best readers and pals. 3XXQ chapter shoutouts. The Derp Knight It's Bella. 00 Fiamami. Thank you peeps. DM me if you want to know how to get a shoutout too. This contains mature content. Fam. Oh ooh 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 ooh. Mateo stopped moving. His entire frame looked pained, and I couldn't even see his face in the darkness. I did love him. I wasn't lying, but the words still felt so strange to hear coming out of my mouth considering the tumultuous relationship we have had. Perhaps it was also strange to hear myself say those words because of the context in which I was saying them in. I was a vampire hybrid recently bitten by a werewolf who realized she was in love. What a bizarre turn of events. But the more and more I thought about it, love and death were very much so intertwined. It only seemed fitting that I lived up to at least one cliché in my life, the final dying omission of love for another. Don't say that back to me, Olive. His voice sounded strained, whether from anger or another emotion entirely I didn't know. I shook my head and the most bizarre feeling of joy flooded my system. "You can't tell me what to do anymore. I'm dying, Mateo. I'm dying and I love you through it all." Mateo finally turned around and faced me. "Olive, don't. It's my decision to make. I'm the one who has been put through hell and back again these past weeks." I started and pushed off of the wall. I felt my eyes watering up again and a hot tear rolling down my cheek. I feel it and I don't need any werewolf instinct to know that, so stop trying to fucking order me around in whatever time I have left and just do something about it already. He didn't move right away. I was expecting this grandiose moment where Mateo rushed to me and we just fucking went at it against the wall, but my life is hardly grandiose or idealistic in the slightest. Mateo hesitated. I could see the confusion and concern marred across his features, even in the dismal lighting, and I know it was only a few seconds of waiting, but I swear those seconds felt like centuries. But when he finally moved, it felt like time itself stopped in its tracks. Mateo came forward, his cadence slow and deliberate as he made his way to stand directly in front of me. He first reached his hand out, lovingly tracing the line of my jaw up to my cheek. I involuntarily caught myself leaning into his touch, but Mateo's caress was all too short. Next, his hand found its way to the ape of my neck where he gathered my hair together and with a resolute tug had my head arched up to meet his. It was sinfully painful, and before I had time to really register what was taking place, his lips cascaded down onto mine. He pinned my face to his with his firm grasp on the back of my head, but it wasn't enough for either of us. Instantly, I threw my arms around his neck, and with his free hand he scooped me up and locked my legs around his waist. Mateo released my hair only to focus on a new target. He clawed at my shirt and tore it from my frame, letting it fall to the floor. My chest was painfully pressed against his as I twined my fingers through his thick curls. I was insatiable. My head was pressed against Mateo's bare chest, his steady heartbeat pounding softly against my ear as he dozed off underneath me. His arm was wrapped around my torso and my leg draped across his body. We were intertwined physically, but in another sense altogether, emotionally. I meant it when I'd said that I felt the bond, or felt something pulling me to him and us. This feeling of complete bliss in a situation of utter chaos and hopelessness was what it was all about. Definitely worth all the fuss. My eyes had long since adjusted to the darkness of the small room, and I was able to peer up at Mateo without fear of being caught ogling. Honestly, if someone 2 months ago were to come up to me and tell me that my cherry would be popped by the dark alpha from Malice Pack while we were imprisoned in my not dead, evil vampire mother's lair, would have thought they were positively mental. But I mean, having the sexual intercourse while we were prisoners, and more importantly perhaps, right after I've learned of my impending death, is kind of mental. When Amias found out about Mateo and I, which he undoubtedly would, I'm sure he would lose his mind as well. OF seeking SHT. I flew up out of the bed. Mateo's arm that had been slung across my body was rapidly pushed off of me. He woke with a start, staring quizzically up at me with a tired look strung across his features. It tugged at the more emotional side of me for a split second. Even big and bad alphas like Mateo needed rest, and right then, I could tell the past days were taxing on him. But this was about Amias. Fran and Devin, where the hell were they? Were they all right? Were they alive? I hated to admit it, but they definitely slipped my mind after the rapid procession of events that had just taken place. And despite the fact that I wanted nothing more to lay forever in Mateo's arms like this, my friends needed me just as I had needed them. Mateo, we have to get to them, we have to help, I exclaimed, twining my hands through my hair. What kind of friend was I? I'd completely left them to fend for themselves. A lousy one, that was for sure. Mateo was expressionless for a moment, as if mulling over our shared neglect, when suddenly his eyes nearly popped out of his skull. Jesus, Olive, your neck. My hand flew to the juncture of skin where I was certain there would be the grisly wound of the mark bearing down on my skin, but there was nothing. Mateo sat up from the bed and carefully, as if I was made of the finest glass, cupped my neck in his hand as he drew me closer for a better look. He shook his head, clearly as bewildered as I was, and leaned back away from me. His keen eyes raked over my face, searching for something I wasn't sure of. I slowly pulled the sheet around my body, all too aware of his prying stare, to which he rolled his eyes. It's not like I haven't seen it before now, Olive. Mateo chided me softly, but I wasn't having it. I held the fabric closer to me. This is serious. Your handiwork has suddenly disappeared in a matter of hours, Tio. That isn't worrying you in the slightest. What the hell did this mean? Guys, I posted the first spin-off book to this story. It is called Talia and the Tale of Two Packs. It takes place in the same universe as Olive, but this time it is focusing on different packs. It will be updated alongside Olive, so you'll be getting updates from 2 different stories at once in this new story. You'll get to know about the Wayward and Creed packs. You'll also get to meet Talia and Aleo in the process. Go check it out. 3. Let me know what you think. Oh, ooh, 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 ooh. I let out a sigh of relief and took off with the rest of the group, pounding across the marbled floor towards freedom. Devin, Fran, Amias, and Mateo were all through the door and standing in the sunshine when a voice from behind me sent me skidding to a stop just inches away from the exit. Olive. My entire body froze up. There was no way. I pivoted on my heel and I collapsed to the floor. Daddy. I hadn't heard that voice in years, but it was one that I would never forget. He waited there, in the same clothes as the last time I saw him was my father. His hair was overgrown and his face haggard with age, but it was him. All this time I presumed that he was dead. After all, it had been years of searching in vain. This couldn't be possible. But even if Mateo's suspicions about my father being captured by Lysander were correct, and he actually had been imprisoned for all these years, it just didn't make sense. From the little I knew about my mother, there wasn't a chance he would be alive right now. I tilted my head to the side as my father reached his hand out to me, beckoning me into his arms. I felt my lower lip trembling as I stared across the seemingly endless expanse of room between us. With him, all of the bullying, it was manageable. I could have had the most ruthless day of tormenting in the pack, but I would come home and run into my dad's arms and everything just seemed to melt away. When he vanished, the torturing was unbearable. I recalled the countless nights I spent sobbing, begging and pleading for anything or anyone to bring me back the one person who had actually loved me. And there he was, standing before me, waiting for me to run into his arms as if not a day had passed since we had last seen each other. I couldn't break his gaze in fear that if I did, he'd disappear just as he'd done all those years ago. I took a single step towards him, away from the door. But before I could take another step, before I could do anything at all really, Matteo was quick to grab my upper arm. It was as if he could sense irrational action before I'd even made up my mind how to react. I blinked and tore my eyes away, my head jerked painfully back towards Matteo. My eyes rapidly scanned his features. I looked at all of my friends standing expectantly behind him. They were all waiting for me. I searched for understanding, but I found nothing from Matteo. He gently guided me back towards the exit. My legs were locked frozen, and I stumbled clumsily backwards. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to see this through. I owed it to myself. So I posted the first chapter of my new book. In case you didn't know already, it is a spin-off of Olive's story, and the first of many in a series. I will be writing it is about a werewolf named Talia, and it is gonna be lit for reals. Go give it a look. If you dig it, leave a comment and vote 3 shoutouts for this chapter. Are Cali Bear 14 Adriana V Blade to celebrate for the first time ever. This chapter will be in a different POV. Whoop whoop. Oh ooh 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 ooh. Mateo's POV. There were legends of this sort of thing. I remembered studying ancient scrolls while I was a part of Ardor that detailed wolves who survived vampire bites and vice versa. Hybrids. They were things of myth and storybooks now. After all, it was practically universally accepted that a bite from either opposite specie equaled a death sentence. However, in the old days, there were the rare accounts of creatures who had not only successfully lived through the transition, but they thrived. Hybrids that could live in duality, harmoniously with the two combating sides of themselves, whilst reaping the benefits from either supernatural part of them. It was also at this time in Ardor that I started to realize they were all positively mad, which is why the possibility of something like that happening today had always seemed outlandish to me. The sound of cracking bones clearly begged to differ. The knife slipped from my fingers and I rushed to Olive's side. Her body was contorting in pain as it once had by the river, but there was something about this time that was much more terrifying. Her arms snapped and she collapsed forwards with a scream tearing through her throat. Before she could hit the ground, I supported her pained body. It's going to be okay. Let the shift go. Let it happen. I tried my best to soothe her with some affirmation, but I didn't even believe myself in the moment. I highly doubted it would ever be okay. Not very alpha-esque of me, but what the hell? It hasn't been a very alpha-ish couple of weeks either. I was even beginning to sound like her. A roar pierced through the room, and I immediately released Olive right before she finally shifted into her wolf. Her wolf was brown like her brunette locks, and while, to the unobservant eye, there was seemingly nothing remarkable about her coloration, but to me it was perfect because it was olive. It was small, which was to be expected with the delay and all the other madness surrounding her bloodline. But like my wolf, instantly I sensed a speed about her. If Olive looked scared, Lysander looked petrified. She clearly had not read up on her werewolf history. Olive took a hesitant step forward, and it was obvious that she was still trying to find her footing. I offered my hand to help balance her, and instantly, a deep pain radiated up my arm, almost bringing me down to my knees beside her once more. I could feel everything within me again. A warmth that had slowly been dimming was burning brighter than ever before. The wound on my stomach was no longer there, and the helplessness I experienced had vanished as well. Reminder to go and check out the second book in this series, Talia, and the Tale 2 packs if that store starts to get a little love. I will drop the third story, Mercy, and the Merciless Alpha, and update all 3 books in sync with each other. That would mean 3 different updates a week, potentially. Go check it out. Oh, ooh, 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 there's a sharp and yet very dull pain radiating from my chest. Sounds were all around me, and yet I couldn't open my eyes. I tried to move my arms, but nothing would budge. It felt as if I had run 17 marathons, and my body was just too spent to function. I took a deep breath and felt a heavy weight on me, restricting my breathing. This time, when I attempted to lift my hand to investigate, my limb not only moved but came into contact with an object protruding from my chest. Suddenly, my eyes snapped wide open and I was back in the large audience hall. Wolves were everywhere. Mateo was circling around Lysander and my blood was everywhere. I had shifted. It all came crashing back to me, flooding my senses and blinding me temporarily. Finally, after all these years, I'd found my wolf, and then my own mother attempted to kill me with her FC King walking stick, and Mateo's wolf was restored and the mate bond, our mate bond. It was completed. My hand wrapped around the cylindrical object sticking out of the right side of my chest. I followed its length to the top and remembered it was Lysander's staff. My mother's weapon was now embedded inside of me. I attempted to tug it out and a scream ripped through my lungs. Mateo's head instantly snapped in my direction. Olive, hold on. He was distracted by me and Lysander took advantage of this, slamming him into the nearest wall, effectively catching him off guard. I began to panic for the situation I found myself in and the danger Mateo was in. With each frightened breath I took, I felt more and more blood begin to seep out of the wound and into the pool that had formed around me. Lysander stalked towards Mateo, who was righting himself already. She threw her hand towards his face and he dodged it with ease. He stepped around her, and from behind, Mateo swung his leg into the soft part of the back of her knee. Her leg buckled and she fell on the floor. Mateo pushed his knee into her back and wrapped his hands around my mother's neck. She clawed at his arms as he attempted to twist her neck and effectively end it all. Lysander growled loudly, and in one swift, unnatural movement, she reversed their positions. She pulled the both of them off of the floor and now stood behind Mateo, wrapping her forearm around his throat, pulling tight. I want you to know this, dear Olive, if you're even still with us. Lysander breathed out heavily. Everything that is happening here is because of you. His death and your father's is because you chose them. Mateo shook his head rapidly. That's not true and you know it, Olive. She's deranged, don't listen to her. Lysander increased the pressure on his neck, and Mateo groaned out loud as he gripped her forearm, trying to pry her hands away. His face was turning red now. I felt a tear rolling down my cheek as I wrapped my hands around the scythe once more, but this time I didn't stop. I ripped the wooden staff from my chest, muscles and tissues ripping and igniting my body in a burning fire of pain, but none of it mattered. Amias, Devin and Fran paraded inside of the entryway, all the while Amias grumbled under his breath about inappropriate public displays of affection. My first reaction was to scoff and roll my eyes, but as I rolled off of Mateo and my back pressed soberingly against the cool marble floor, it was like I was coming down from this massive runner's high. All of the euphoric adrenaline that had been coursing through my system vanished. Amias and his righteous judgment brought me back to earth instantly. I clambered up off the floor, causing Mateo to follow in suit, standing with a low groan as he sought to help balance me. He held an arm around my waist as I surveyed the room. My father. He was still on the floor in a pool of his own blood, unmoving and mute. If it weren't for the crimson pool around him, it would almost look like he was sleeping. But he wasn't sleeping. Mateo followed my gaze across the room and tightened his arm around my waist, turning me away from my father. It was almost as if he could feel the impending emotional crash. I was coming down from the climax, and I realized that I lost both of my parents today. More importantly, I lost my father today. God, I felt so stupid. Moments ago, I'd been all over Mateo, just feet away from all of this carnage. He pressed his lips against my hair. Don't beat yourself up. Mateo murmured lowly, you're a brand new wolf experiencing everything fully for the very first time. We all respond in our own way. Mateo's gaze flickered across the room before giving my shoulder a comforting squeeze. Take it slow. I took a deep breath. Amias walked over to my father and covered him up with some sort of curtain he'd taken down from a window, I assumed. Letting out the breath I'd been holding with a nod, I turned my gaze up to Mateo and looped my arms around his neck. What's going to happen next? Mateo looked down at me with a newfound fondness and parted his lips, but as he began to answer me, he was cut off by a sudden interruption. Do you guys hear that? It was Devin. We all turned to face the lone vampire. The room fell silent as we all collectively tried to pick up on what Devin was hearing. I got nothing. No one did. Fran furrowed her brow. You must be hallucinating because there's no way a vampire could ever have better hearing than a werewolf. Devin ignored Fran and her snarky remark entirely as he shook his head and pressed on. You guys don't smell that either. I shook my head, as did the rest of our group. Devin ran both hands through his hair, seemingly out of frustration, before he wordlessly took off down the empty hallway, going after, I guessed, whatever he'd supposedly heard. Fran frowned, and after a moment of blankly staring after Devin, she returned her attention to Amia's and helping him with all the aftermath. Mateo rolled his eyes irritably and gently took my chin and returned my attention back to him. Olive, we get to go and live our lives. Mateo paused together. Okay, for real this time, I think she is dead. A nervous male voice dimly broke through my groggy subconscious. There is no way in a million years that she's dead, she's just sleepy. Another voice, a girl this time. I'm a healer and I can confirm that no one sleeps for this long. In training, you're a healer still in training. Besides, you were wrong last time and you're wrong again this time. Maybe there's a reason you're still in training. Ever consider that? Rude, that was just plain rude. Should we tell Alpha, though, just in case? Are you insane? There is nothing going on. There's no reason we should tell him. Suddenly another speaker broke through the two bickering voices. No reason to tell me what. At that moment, my eyes instantaneously snapped open, and I flew up from the bed I was laying in, almost as if my subconscious could sense the arrival of Mateo. Fran and Amia's were standing closest to me. She smiled warmly while Amia's, dramatic as ever, put his hand over his heart, as if he couldn't be more relieved to see me. As much as I loved the two in front of me, I was completely and utterly transfixed by the man leaning casually in the doorway. My mate. We weren't in the same hospital room I found myself in when I first arrived in Malice. This room was much more dimly lit. Everything was primarily black or neutral tones, with the exception for the walls, which were this lovely dark green color. My eyes traveled around the room, taking it all in, before they fell back on Mateo, who stood dressed from head to toe in all black. His shirt fitted perfectly against his tanned skin, and his pants clung dangerously against his hips. I almost fell backwards and back into bed again. That was a sight I certainly would never get used to. Amias rushed forward and threw his arms around me, crushing me against his frame. My little olive martini is safe and sound. Fran cleared her throat and he sheepishly backed away from me. She gestured pointedly with her eyes towards the door. Amias instantly understood, and the pair skirted out of the room, but not before he stuck his head back. Have fun, lovebirds. Fran groaned and yanked him out, closing the door behind them, and then suddenly I was all alone with Mateo. From the moment I woke up, his eyes had never left me, and I was nervous. I couldn't help it, but it wasn't the terrified kind of nervous, more like the stupid, giddy, butterfly kind of nervous. Mateo pushed off from the door with a smug smile and slowly crossed the room towards me, but it wasn't fast enough. I clambered out of the obscenely tall bed to meet him halfway, but I tangled myself up in the blankets in my rush, and I stumbled forwards and down towards the floor. A pair of arms stopped me. They wrapped around me. Mateo held me almost as if we were dancing, and it was the part where he would dip me down. I stared wide-eyed up at him, breathless and at a loss for words. Mateo spoke first. I have some bad news. My stomach dropped. It seemed like bad things were attracted to us. The Wolfless Werewolf Club has been dissolved, Mateo said with a grin as he lifted me up, holding me closely in his arms still. It appears that the two members violated the founding rule of the club and no longer applied for membership. Push, keep pushing, Olive. You're doing great, keep going, just a little more now. That's it, you did it, you really did it. I was breathing heavily as I wiped the sweat off my brow, my entire body sore from the exertion. Amias beamed down at me. She's beautiful, Olive. I jolted and quirked my eyebrow up at him. He nodded. You are giving your bassinet a gender now? I questioned from my spot on the floor. Amias scoffed, but of course. In a whirlwind decision that was so like Amias, he and Felix announced that they wanted to adopt a baby. Werewolf baby adoption was virtually unheard of, as mates tended to be fiercely loyal to their pups. However, there were rare cases where a female wolf was rejected after conception to be left on her own and raise a child. This usually meant the mother was a rogue at that point. After everything settled down, Devin and Anna declined our offer to stay with us in Malice. They said it was too stinky for them. Cue the big eye roll. So instead, the pair have spent a lot of time exploring the land, partly for enjoyment and partly to find a new place to call their own, I imagined. On their travels, Devon stumbled upon a rogue wolf who was on her own and very pregnant. Her mate rejected and banished her. She'd been on her own for months now. So when Devon politely inquired about the baby and what her intentions were with it, she was almost too happy to allow Amias and Felix to adopt it. The rogue temporarily moved to Malice for the remainder of her pregnancy because she was obstinately determined to get back into her pack now that she wouldn't have a baby with her. And any day now, Amias and Felix were expecting the arrival of their baby. At first, the thought of Amias raising a kid absolutely terrified me. No one thought he was ready for such a challenge. But he and Felix were undoubtedly an incredible team. They were complete opposites of each other, and it completely worked. They balanced each other nicely. He glanced around the room. Thanks again, Ollie. That was some good teamwork action we had back there. I frowned. Teamwork. I read the instructions, I put it together, and then I pushed the damn thing all over the room because you kept changing where you wanted it to stay. Amias popped his tongue loudly in a very Alyssa Edwards-esque manner. Agree to disagree. He slung an arm around my shoulders. Regardless, Felix, baby and I are all eternally grateful for your physical labor. I rolled my eyes and slipped out of his arm while pulling out my phone from my pocket to check the time. It was almost noon, which meant I had to get back to Mateo. Amias saw me checking the time and he patted me on the back. Everything is going to be fine. He assured with a bright smile, now get going. I don't want to face the wrath of Mateo for making you late. He was right. This was one thing I couldn't be late for. So after a quick hug, I slipped out of his house and made my way over to our place. Normally, today wouldn't have been anything special. It would probably be just like any other day at Malice. Mateo and I would be working, Fran would be out on patrol, and Amias would be working in the infirmary. But it wasn't a normal day. Exactly a year ago today, Alpha Isabel issued a warning bounty on my head at noon on the dot. We all immediately laughed off the threat. It seemed ridiculous for a pack like hers to make such a bold threat like that. Even after it slipped from the minds of our pack, the threat hung in the air like a silent weight over me, and today the anxiety returned at full force on my shoulders. Hello, friends, this is not a chapter sadness buet. I've got some exciting news and info about the sequel to this book and my other books. Read until the end for an exciting surprise first. If you loved Olive's story, I think you'd love my new book, Mercy and the Merciless Alpha. It's my literal child now, and I'm deadass so excited to write the SHT out of this book. 3 Here's the little descript about it. What the hell is wrong with you? Are you really going to put your own mate in prison? I wrapped my hands around the cold steel bars that separated us only slightly. Even in the dimly lit, musty jail, I watched Azrael's stoic face upturn into a smug, sadistic smile. You seem to forget, mate. His words riddled with venom. Without me, you are nothing. I gripped the bars painfully harder as I was unable to anything else, my knuckles turning white. I shook my head defiantly even as hot tears silently rolled down my cheeks. I own you. Azrael leaned closer and reached his arm between the bars, grabbing a hold of my face before I could pull away. He tilted his head as he used his thumb to stroke my tear-stained cheek. There isn't a breath you breathe that doesn't belong to me, and no amount of your little magic will ever change that. Oh, ooh, 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 ooh. The moon goddess played a cruel joke when she paired Azrael and Mercy as mates. The alpha of death and a girl with magical healing abilities were doomed before they even met. The two were the exact foil of the other. They were magnets constantly repelling away from one another. Then why was it? No matter what the Mercy or Azrael did, they couldn't stay away. Mercy and the Merciless Alpha. Second, some Olive news. The sequel is already being written. I want to get at least 10 chapters done before I start posting, but it's still exciting. I will be posting the first couple chapters in this book, as well as the actual sequel book, just to make the transfer easier for readers. Finally, this kinda pains me, but I'm putting Talia and the tale of 2 packs on hold. 3 I hit a block writing it, so I'm just gonna go with my heart and keep focusing on writing Mercy and the sequel. Many apologies. Now, onto the exciting surprise. In regards to the sequel, if you actually read to the end of this update and comment an emoji down below if you go and vote on the first 3 chapters of Mercy, you will be entered into a drawing to have your name as a prominent character in the sequel to all of the other Werewolves. Alrighty, thank you for reading. Have a great day. 3xxq. Okay, so bit of a recap, and then some juicy new content for this juicy new story. Okay, Ty, enjoy. Push. Keep pushing, Olive. You're doing great. Keep going. Just a little more now. That's it. You did it. You really did it. I was breathing heavily as I wiped the sweat off my brow. My entire body sore from the exertion. Amia's beamed down at me. She's beautiful, Olive. I jolted and quirked my eyebrow up at him. He nodded. You are giving your bassinet a gender now? I questioned from my spot on the floor. Amia's scoffed, but of course. In a whirlwind decision that was so like Amia's, he and Felix announced that they wanted to adopt a baby. Werewolf baby adoption was virtually unheard of, as mates tended to be fiercely loyal to their pups. However, there were rare cases where a female wolf was rejected after conception to be left on her own and raise a child. This usually meant the mother was a rogue at that point. After everything settled down, Devin and Anna declined our offer to stay with us in Malice. They said it was too stinky for them. Cue the big eye roll. So instead, the pair have spent a lot of time exploring the land, partly for enjoyment and partly to find a new place to call their own, I imagined. On their travels, Devin stumbled upon a rogue wolf who was on her own and very pregnant. Her mate rejected and banished her. She'd been on her own for months now. So when Devin politely inquired about the baby and what her intentions were with it, she was almost too happy to allow Amias and Felix to adopt it. The rogue temporarily moved to Malice for the remainder of her pregnancy temporarily, because she was obstinately determined to get back into her pack now that she wouldn't have a baby with her. And any day now, Amias and Felix were expecting the arrival of their baby. At first, the thought of Amias raising a kid absolutely terrified me. No one thought he was ready for such a challenge. But he and Felix were undoubtedly an incredible team. They were complete opposites of each other, and it completely worked. They balanced each other nicely. He glanced around the room. Thanks again, Ollie. That was some good teamwork action we had back there. I frowned. Teamwork? I read the instructions, I put it together, and then I pushed the damn thing all over the room because you kept changing where you wanted it to stay. Amias popped his tongue loudly in a very Alyssa Edwards-esque manner. Agree to disagree. He slung an arm around my shoulders. Regardless, Felix, baby and I are all eternally grateful for your physical labor. I rolled my eyes and slipped out of his arm while pulling out my phone from my pocket to check the time. It was almost noon, which meant I had to get back to Mateo. Amias saw me checking the time, and he patted me on the back. Everything is going to be fine. He assured with a bright smile, now get going. I don't want to face the wrath of Mateo for making you late. He was right. This was one thing I couldn't be late for. So after a quick hug, I slipped out of his house and made my way over to our place. Normally, today wouldn't have been anything special. It would probably be just like any other day at Malice. Mateo and I would be working, Fran would be out on patrol, and Amias would be working in the infirmary. Hello, friends. A while ago, before starting the sequel, I asked if it was a good idea to keep both books under this one story, or to separate them, and at the time, I thought leaving them as one was the right call, but I've decided that I want to give Olive to her very own moment Suo in the next 10-ish minutes. I will be uploading the brand new story, the official sequel to all of the other Werewolves, as well as 2 new chapters, and tomorrow will be a 3rd chapter uploaded to it as well. With that said, some other exciting news: this book reached 1 million reads. I still can't even believe it when I check my page. So as this is the last update in this book until we move over to the sequel, I want to say thank you one more time. I have made so many friends through this story, had so many laughs, and grown so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for loving these characters and putting up with me. See you in the sequel. XXQ.